Hello, this is Howard Hughes at the home of the unexplained in London. Tonight, we're going to do something a little bit different for a very good reason. Did you realize that it's nearly 50 years since Apollo 11 landed on the moon and made heroes of 3 men? Well, tonight, as the world begins a month of recollections and reflections on this humanity-changing event, we're going to be talking here about mankind's greatest achievement to date. And to start this special edition of The Unexplained, here comes a round trip, 50 years in space, beginning and ending with Apollo 11.
Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Atlantis copies, negative.
Atlantis now too far downrange, too high in altitude to return to the launch site in the event of an engine failure. All 3 engines performing perfectly. 4 minutes, 20 seconds into the flight. Atlantis now 62 miles in altitude, 180 miles downrange, traveling almost 6,000 miles an hour. All systems performing normally. Atlantis on course, on track for its preliminary orbit.
It's like a glass-bottom boat. This is the cupola. It sticks down below the space station. It's one of those places you find yourself hanging out in all the time because all you want to do is look back at our planet. I think some questions I had were about what do you do in your free time? And you can't help but want to just come to the cupola and look outside as much as you can. I play this game with myself about where we're flying over the Earth. I try to come in here and just
And Tim Peake now has joined the Cobra at the base of the 1B solar array, right at the very end of the starboard truss of the International Space Station as they begin to set up all of their equipment for the start of the removal of the failed voltage regulator, the sequential shunt unit that failed due to an apparent internal short back on November 13th.
Agreed, I'm at the starboard seated car, so all safety tethers look clear.
Great news, thanks, Tim.
With this, we have another small step that's being taken in extending human presence beyond Earth and actually bring that experience of exploring the planets back a little bit closer to all of us and actually extending that human touch. As Curiosity continues her mission, we hope that the words of the administrator will be an inspiration to someone who's alive today, who will become the first to stand upon the surface of the planet Mars. Like the great Neil Armstrong, they'll be able to speak aloud in first person at that point of the next giant leap in human exploration. So if we could have the video piece.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful, Radio. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here.
The Earth is quite beautiful from space and from the moon. It looks quite small and quite remote, but it's very blue and covered with white lace of the clouds, and the continents are clearly seen, although they have very little color from that distance.
The voice of Neil Armstrong, the man who first set foot on the moon, sounding as matter-of-fact about it as he always was. That last piece you heard was from a 1970 interview, and of course before that was the actual event itself. And what you've just heard is a round trip of 50 years in space exploration, including the great British astronaut Tim Peake, the space shuttle, the International Space Station, and what we're talking about mostly tonight, the landing on the moon on Apollo 11 in July 1969. So let me set out the stall for tonight. The people you're going to hear Jack Loosmer, Apollo 13 astronaut, Joe Pappalardo from Popular Mechanics, he's their famous space writer about the future of space exploration. 2 of my good friends, Nigel Henbest and Heather Cooper, both famous and experienced seasoned astronomers who were around at that time and have very vivid recollections. You'll hear from James Burke, the man who fronted the BBC's coverage of that mission. He and Cliff Mitchellmore, of course, fronted all of the programs throughout Apollo, and many people will remember them, so we'll hear his voice tonight. You'll hear from Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, a remarkable man who sadly left us a few years ago. And you'll hear from David Chudwin, a name that you may not know, but you will by the end of tonight. Now, David Chudwin was a teenager at the time of Apollo 11 and the moon launch and landing. He managed to get accreditation and credentials to be allowed to be the only teenage student reporter to cover that. His recollections tonight you will find amazing, I'm sure. Plus, we'll talk about the entire Apollo 11 mission, from the genesis of the Apollo program and John F. Kennedy promising to send a man to the moon and bring him back within a period of years. David Whitehouse, former BBC science editor, good friend of this show, and author of what's becoming the definitive book about the Apollo 11 mission. He will be here tonight to explain exactly what happened and how it happened. So a big night, starting with David Whitehouse and that overview of the entire Apollo program, zeroing in on the characters not only on board Apollo 11, but the people around that mission. So, Dr. David Whitehouse in Hampshire tonight, thank you very much for coming on this special show, David.
You're welcome.
Nice to see you. Now, you are the man behind what I think personally, and we've talked about this on my podcast and on the air, a great book about the Apollo 11 mission and the people behind it. How's the book doing?
It's doing very well. I mean, you never know when you write a book, because you think it's brilliant. Because the test is when other people are going to look at it and thank you for your kind comments, and others seem to like it as well. So it's selling pretty well, and I'm really pleased.
And the difference between this book, and I've read a lot of books about the Apollo era, including Armstrong's own book about it, which is good, it's very good. Your book, though, has a collection of anecdotes and stories that I really haven't seen before.
Well, I tried to collect what I knew and what I've been told, because I've been following Apollo for 40 years now, since I was quite young. And I've got a collection of tapes, of interviews, of things written down on the back of napkins, of funny stories. Somebody digged me in the ribs and said, that actually, you know about him, guess what happened? So I tried to sort of remember all those and make the book more intimate and human, because, if you say that, they were launched on such a time as such a rocket and they took so long, that's interesting. But more interesting for me was what they were thinking when this thing was going up underneath them. And did they think when they pressed that button they would actually get where they were going, and what were the jokes that were told inside the capsule?
Because you would have to have, we've both worked in newsrooms, and newsrooms often work with a kind of dark, black humour. And I would imagine those guys had that too.
Well, they weren't unaware of the problems. They knew, even though sometimes they didn't talk about it, they knew their lives were on the line. For instance, in the book I say that had Apollo 13 accident happened when the servicemen had that happened on Apollo 8, and it could have done when they went round the moon with no lunar module lifeboat, they would have all died. And the whole story of American spaceflight would have been different. So they knew, and I have great admiration for the Apollo 8 crew. They were the first to press the button to leave the Earth. More so, in fact, than perhaps Armstrong or Aldrin and Collins, because they were the third crew to leave the Earth. They knew it could be done. What they didn't know is the landing. But courage, quiet courage, and stability and calmness is what these guys were all about.
Do you think that there are people around like that? This is a strange question. It has to be asked. Do you think that there are people who have that kind of intestinal fortitude around today?
I'm sure they are. I'm sure that if circumstances were the same, you would find people like that. But these days, space is in the main something different. You have space workers, people whose job it is to go up into space. Now, the pilots, and particularly the pilots of these new craft that are coming along, will have to go through something of the quiet courage of a test flight. But nothing I think we will see in the future is going to be like, say, the first crew to sit on top of a Saturn V, the Apollo 8, the first crew to try and land on the moon, the first crew to get close to the moon, Apollo 10, or indeed, the most dangerous test flight of all time was the first flight of the space shuttle. Courage. John Young, who was in command of that, said his heart rate went up to about 150, and he said he couldn't go any faster. It literally was at its top speed. It's interesting that the astronauts you talk to today, they call these people the gods of Apollo. And that's quite right. They did do something special with the new technology, with the dangerous technology. You saw from the disaster of Apollo 1 and through its died, that health and safety had not caught up with them. And you've just got to look at what they did, how they did it.
And of course,
It's just amazing.
people looking in on this, and people working on it too, would have quite naturally assumed that they were working, because they were, with cutting-edge technology. But as we look back on it through the prism of history, we realise that compared with what we can do today, they had very little.
Yes, in fact, your smartphone is something like 1 million times more powerful than the Apollo landing computer or the guidance computer, although that computer in Apollo, in the command module and in the lunar lander, was revolutionary for the time, and it set the standard for computing to come, because it had to be able to, if it crashed, it had to be able to start again from where it started. And it was a remarkable bit of software and hardware that did boost electronics. But you're right, when you see the movies, you see the footage of the real thing, you see lots and lots of switches. You know, there are 500 switches in the command module. And you think, well, that's a bit old-fashioned. These days we'd have a computer screen and keyboard. But the beauty of it is that the astronaut knew all the switches. So he was a switch away from doing something. He didn't have to go through a computer. So that meant when Apollo 13 was in real trouble, or when something didn't happen, the astronaut knew exactly which switch, and he could get right inside the mechanics of this machine, exactly how it works. There wasn't much between him and the rocket booster, and the thruster, and the battery, and the main electrical supply. So this was incredible flying, using a machine which was really complicated, but was very versatile, because they knew it inside out.
And we're talking about the technology. Here's an example for maybe somebody who wasn't around at that time, and that's going to be a lot of people hearing this now who are not going to have any conception of it.
20% of people alive today were around in the past. Only 20%. Most people.
1/5. So that's the other 4/5 were not there, but have seen it on TV and have read about it.
That's right. They think the moonwalk was Michael Jackson.
Yeah. Thought it was. But if we think about the technology, displays. Now, we are all used to LCD displays. They did not have those. They had hot, illuminated displays of numbers, and which were very complicated and were not as flexible and sophisticated as what we have now. That's a tiny example of the kind of equipment that they were working on. Okay, in these remaining minutes then, David, before we go to commercials and then we talk about some other things, let's just nail down the details of the mission. The actual mission to get a man on the moon and bring the man back. That was JFK's work.
Well, he picked it up. But of course, remember that in 1960, after the shock of Sputnik, which really did shock America, they thought they were the bee's knees. And this upstart, crude, technological nation that had lost the war, put Sputnik in space, frightened America. So it was in 1960 that NASA got together and said, how in the long run can we beat the Russians? And they said, go to the moon. We're going to probably lose the race for the first person in space, but we could probably beat them to the moon. And when Kennedy came in to power, he saw this as his great thing, his great speech. He had loads of problems with money, but he thought if he can start this running, then perhaps either it would carry on or he could compromise and work with the Russians. It was his thing. And although credit must be given to Lyndon Johnson, he was the greatest space president of all.
Because Kennedy was assassinated and Johnson had to see it through.
That's right.
And Johnson could easily have been cold on it, couldn't he?
Oh, but he was a space cadet. He was keener than almost any other president, partly because he was a master politician who knew that this was the legacy of a dead president, and that America would not tolerate the memory of Kennedy being sullied by not achieving the goal. But he also knew how to do it. He was an unappreciated, remarkable space president.
Who actually saw the thing through in a remarkable way. And I don't think, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I'm looking at it through the binoculars of somebody of my generation, but I just wonder if something so complex that required so much commitment, as much as various presidents recently have talked about, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, I wonder if we could actually pile together the degree of commitment today to do something as groundbreaking, literally, as that now?
Well, in America, in the past, presidents were more powerful than they were today. There wasn't as much oversight. The government wasn't as open as it is now. The media wasn't in their face all the time criticising what they did. You had to cope with, say, the New York Times and a few other newspapers. Nowadays, as we know, the media are onto the government all the time about their spending. So it's much more difficult these days to pick up something as big as that and run with it. Particularly when politicians think short term and they think I'll get more votes if I drop this and I spend it on something else.
Okay, finally in this segment then, give us an idea of the, for the time, gargantuan amounts of money that were involved in this.
There's a tape which was released about 10 years ago from the Presidential Kennedy Archive, and it shows James Webb going to President Kennedy in the early days, asking for some money. The president is keen on this, and they disagreed about a lot, but the president wanted to do it, and James Webb wanted to do it. He was told by his people at NASA, we probably could get somewhere with $3 billion. You better ask for 5. On the tape, he goes in, you literally hear him hit the desk. He said, we can do it for 10.
That is the art of negotiation. We're talking with David Whitehouse, a man who's written a great book about Apollo 11. This is the Unexplained Apollo 11 50th Anniversary Special. Let's talk, David, now about the people who were involved in this. I think we've got to unpick the stories of the astronauts, the people who were finally selected, and what they had to have in order to do this. But also the people who are not talked about nearly as much, and were equally important, if not more so, the people who were actually operating the equipment, who were behind the scenes, who were controlling the launch and the mission.
I think one hero who's not talked about much is George Muller. He was brought in at a crisis. I think around about 63, 64. Apollo really was in a crisis because this is a huge project. Not only did you have to build these rockets down in Huntsville, but you had to find a launch site, and that involved a construction like nothing anybody had ever seen. Millions and millions of tons of concrete being poured in Florida. You also had to have training facilities. You also had to manage all the companies that are building the various bits of the rocket. You have to integrate them. It's enormous, and nobody really. Another achievement of Apollo is that they did that, but at that time nobody knew how to do it, and there was a crisis. And they thought, how can we do this? We're not going to get on. We're not going to get the decade goal to get first people in space. And so they were rescued by actually the Polaris team from the military. The military developed the Polaris intercontinental missile, and that was a superbly run project. And so they quite naturally said, let's get some people in from Polaris. And among that intake came George Miller, who completely changed the way NASA did things, and actually was the person who got them to the moon for a decade, because he said, you need to learn what Werner von Braun. The way the Germans built a rocket was they'd build one bit, test it to bits, build another bit, connect it to that, test it to bits, add the third bit, test it. Because you can't build a rocket that sacrifices a million parts. You'll never get anywhere testing a rocket like that.
Well, money and time would be against you.
That's right. So Muller had the idea, all-up testing, and that's what saved Apollo. He said, you don't test it individually, you test it all up. And so that's why when Apollo 8 went up, not only was it the first full test of the Saturn V, not only was the first full test of the Apollo command module, they actually went around the moon at the same time. That is guts. And it all worked. But had they not had that approach, they couldn't have done it. So I think Muller from the Polaris and the Polaris people are unsung.
What about cooperation from the private sector, from the big American corporations? Did they get on board? I suppose because there were dollars involved, but did they get involved from the start?
They did, and they had their own points of view as to how to do it. Remember, when Apollo was started in 1960, nobody knew how to go to the moon. Nobody knew what type of rocket you needed. Nobody knew the architecture of the mission that actually followed. So you have one company building the lunar module, another company building the commander module, and somebody else building the rocket. And each of these has to be tested, integrated, kept an eye on. And Werner von Braun, who lost power throughout the Apollo project, he slowly his influence was declining because he had the idea of big rockets, big spacecraft, launch several big rockets, connect them together in space, then launch an enormous rocket to the moon. And it was clear that wasn't going to work. It's too big. and he had to be whittled down to this lunar orbit rendezvous which he carried out. And NASA did a very interesting thing, is that they got the astronauts to be involved in the construction with the various private companies. So they went along and kept an eye on this thing, because they were going to fly it. They had a good technical knowledge, which meant that A, they tried to stop them cutting corners, and B, when they got into space with the capsule, they knew it inside out.
Isn't that interesting? Was that the way they did things when the shuttle was designed? Because we know, of course, on a couple of occasions what happened with the shuttle.
Mostly. The shuttle was slightly different in the sense that you had you had a demarcation between pilots and passengers. The pilots of the first tranche of shuttle flights, they knew it inside out because they'd been involved in the testing, testing for the landing, all that business. As you come later on, there were superb pilots who knew the system, but they weren't there when the thing came together. They did the blueprints, they did what everything should do, but they didn't have that, that meeting when they say this pipe doesn't fit that pipe, what should we do? So you could argue that it became more like an airliner, a shuttle, and that could be a fault in its system.
So in some ways, even though the technology would have been more primitive because it was earlier, from that point of view, maybe Apollo had safety inbuilt more than later missions, later programs.
Because people knew it. I mean, particularly the command module pilots. Deke Slayton, who was in charge of the astronaut assignments, said he doesn't want a command module pilot to go to the moon. The command module pilot was the one who stayed in orbit, didn't go down, who was a rookie. They had to have flown it through. And there was a bit of a problem in the astronaut office because nobody wanted to go down the command module training route, because that meant you weren't going to be on the LEM landing on the moon. So you would initially, if you were a command module pilot, you'd go to the moon and stay in orbit, and then you'd hope you'd get a subsequent mission on the lander. And that happened a couple of times. Particularly John Young, who was command module pilot of Apollo 10, and he was the first person to be alone in a spacecraft orbiting the moon. Wow. He got to land on Apollo 16. So there was people were shifting their positions. Remember, 67, 68, once they got over the Apollo 1 fire, and they were looking at Apollo 7 and Apollo 8, they knew the landing was going to happen. So there was all sorts of them jockeying for positions between the astronauts as to who would get on the first landing flight. There was a lot of elements of that. It could easily have been over Neil Armstrong, but they were glad it was. And so, of course, then people did not want to go along the command module pilot route, even though that was probably the most technically difficult part of the mission.
So even though these people were tacticians and technicians and flyers in the moon, there was still the thought of the bottom line is the glory.
Well, there's an apocryphal scene in one of the films of this where they're all sitting in a room, Deke Slayton saying, well, we're going to go to the moon sometime in the next 2 years, and I don't know who the first person to walk on the moon is, but I'm only sitting in this room. I don't think that happened, but it's typical of they knew among them that one of them was going to be the first. And of course there was the Get On With Deke campaign, If you upset Deke Slayton and Alan Shepard, his deputy, who later caused a great fuss when he became flight worthy again and took over Apollo 14 and went back to the moon as the oldest astronaut at the time. Did a superb job, but they didn't like it. There was lots of, manoeuvring for position. And had Apollo 10 failed, had Apollo 8 failed, Apollo 11 would not have made the first landing attempt. But by about January of that year, they were saying that, well, it looks as though things are going pretty well, January 69. Apollo 10, if it works, Apollo 11 is going to make the first landing, and that was Neil Armstrong's mission. It was his crew.
So, in fact, it could have been any of the subsequent crews. It could, if things had gone wrong, if there'd been technical problems, it could have been Apollo 12 that did the moon landing and their crew.
Exactly. It could easily have been.
I never knew that. That's astonishing.
In fact, although the head of NASA, Thomas Paine, had breakfast with the crew a few days before the launch of Apollo 11, And he said to them, look, if you don't make it, if you have to abort and come back, I'll let you go on the next flight and try again. Now, Armstrong, Aldrin and Collins were amazed at this, absolutely amazed. They didn't take it seriously because, let's face it, all the other astronauts would have fitted a word about that.
Well, the one, there would be a group of people who'd be kicked off a mission.
Yeah, the Apollo 12 crew would be told, no, you can't make the first landing, you give it to the Apollo 11 crew. It wouldn't have happened. There would have been riot or strike. But it was indicative of trying to... That was the time, I think, when confidence was low in the Apollo 11 crew. There was a time when Collins was working in the lunar module simulator on his own. Armstrong and Aldrin were in the landing simulator 14, 15 hours a day, living away from home, going back to Houston at weekends. When about a month before, morale was low and they were clearly totally exhausted. And people seriously said, do we have to put off this mission? Are the crew up to it? But no, they gave them some time off and some rest, and they thought, these guys deliver, and they let them do it.
And they had to do it automatically. If there was no question really of having to too much look at manuals, it had to be in your head and in your heart.
They knew everything. They'd spend hundreds and hundreds of hours in the simulator. That's where Apollo achieved, the simulator. Although when Armstrong got the last 3 minutes of flight where he, quote, went to manual, which meant actually the computer was still running, but it was a different program, and he was interacting differently with the computer landing program. When he went to manual, it wasn't like a simulator. It was different. When they pitched over to see the approach for the first time, they were ahead of the curve, and for a while they didn't recognize it. Armstrong's final 3 minutes of landing, where the simulator helped, of course, but it wasn't like a simulator, and he had to look for a clear patch to land, is the greatest feat of aviation flying in history. I mean, I don't think anything even approached it. He deserved the first footprint after that.
It was so amazing, it was almost improbable. Do you not think it was almost like a work of fiction?
Epic, mythical, in fact, because he knew everything inside out. There was he was coming in and he was running out of fuel. Although he was within the tolerance of the fuel, he knew how much fuel he had, and he was only 300 feet above the surface. And he was coming in, the fuel was going down as he expected. But they were still about 90 seconds away from mandatory abort, where they had no choice but to press it. Nobody had tried that before. That was an unknown. But you get the impression with Armstrong, he knew within 5 seconds when the fuel would cut out. He knew the gauge was slightly inaccurate, there was more in there. And he had that within his mentality. He knew exactly what he could do with that vehicle and how much resources he had.
Okay,
that is remarkable.
We'll get more into the specific events because I want to do a kind of chronology of the whole mission in the next segment. To wrap up this one, though, let's just give ourselves, and again for that 4/5 of the audience who were not around at that time and have had to learn about it by hearing or reading about it, let's just give a quick verbal picture of the three people involved here. Armstrong, of course, we know him to be Joe Cool, absolutely the technician, the tactician. Aldrin, something completely different. Three people, three characters.
Yeah, they weren't the closest of crews. Apollo 12 was a much closer crew than Apollo 11. They were three very different people who worked together well, although there was friction with Aldrin. And Armstrong was asked, I think 6 or 7 months before the mission, if he still wanted Aldrin on the flight. But because they were amiable strangers, as it's been called, that was okay. They could work together. Armstrong, introverted, cool, unflappable, a great systems engineer who knew what he was flying, and he didn't panic. Look at how he reacted to Johnny Reynolds when they went out of control. He rescued that mission. He saved his life, saved Joe Scott's life. Aldrin, superb pilot, but probably a better pilot than Armstrong. But driven by his father's opinion, wanting to achieve, wanting to excel, wanting to be number one. And Michael Collins has been called the drummer in the band. He was the safe command. You knew that he got everything covered. You could rely on, and that's the most impressive thing about astronauts, is that if there's a problem or a danger, and they know another astronaut is on it, that's okay. Tom Hanks got this right in Apollo 13, because he knew astronauts. There was a time when they were Apollo 13, they were really really wondering how they would get back to Earth. And Mission Control says, Tom Hanks or John Lovell says, where are the schematics? Where's the simulation? Where is the documentation? And Mission Control said, we're working on that. Tom Mattingly, who should have been on the flight, is in the simulator. And there's a look between Hanks and his crew when they say, that's just great, that's fine. We trust him, that's all right. They had a bond and a trust which is remarkable.
And if you haven't seen that movie, I recommend it. I remember interviewing Sir Patrick Moore when that movie was out, because he was one of the people who was around talking about it.
Yeah, I remember, yeah.
He absolutely adored that film. I wondered whether he'd even seen it. And yes, he had, absolutely.
It's one of the best space films.
But the recreation on Earth of possible solutions to the problems on 13. I know this problem is type 11, but 13 is very much a part of the whole Apollo story. Mattingly's work on Earth to create an air filter, carbon dioxide filter, wasn't it? Was astonishing, because they had to make it out of, literally string and chewing gum almost.
And that shows that even they weren't perfect, because nowadays, hopefully, you would design the carbon dioxide scrubbers for the command module to be interchangeable with the lunar module. But they weren't.
They were different.
One was square, one was round. Where did that come from? Why, nowadays, hopefully, you would have some commonality, but that shows that they were brilliant. So that shows the level of risk of these missions.
And it all depended on duct tape, I think.
Yeah, duct tape and torn apart folders and stuff.
And sheer ingenuity. David Whitehouse is here. We're talking about Apollo 11, the 50th anniversary. As we enter the month of July 2019, we're looking back at 1969. Let's unfold the events here. And let's try and paint a picture of the tension, the excitement, the focus of those days in July 1969.
There's a photograph that's not often seen of, the footage where Armstrong, Aldrin, Collins are leaving the building in their spacesuits. They're carrying their portable air conditioners. They're getting in the back of the van to take them to the rocket. Everybody's applauding. And they're waving. There's a photograph taken in that van a few minutes later when they're actually on the road driving quite a distance, a couple of kilometres to the rocket. And they're taking their helmets off and they're looking at the photographer. And there's a sense in their faces of, it's hard to describe, in the sense that there is an anticipation, but also a fear. Also an apprehension, because they know that they are going to do this thing. They're going to get in this rocket, enormous rocket. They're going to go to Earth orbit. They're going to leave. All these events that have to take place. When they came back, Michael Collins said it was a daisy chain. This event, that event, this event, and each one could have gone wrong. And he was amazed that they all hung together. But right at the start of that daisy chain, as they're actually on bus going to the pad, and they getting the lift up to the pad, getting to the clean room at the top, and then getting into the capsule. There was a quietness. It wasn't time for jokes. It wasn't time for levity. And then there's some film of the door being shut. They're not going to open that door again, for a week until they get back to Earth. They're in there. That's it.
And of course, the ever-present thought that you have to suppress if you're a human being and you've got a mission, that you may not come out of there at all.
They knew that. I mean, it was hard to put facts on it. I mean, people said we've got a 20% chance of not coming back. Armstrong, of course, when he was asked, he'd say things like, well, we've every confidence in the mission and we intend to do a good job. And people say, well, what's the chance of you coming back? We've got every confidence in the mission. He was cool about that. But you can't put a number on this. You just, when things go wrong, the number is 100%. So, yes, the amount of things which could go wrong, even things which had gone wrong in previous missions, which had gone wrong at the right time, and you could get over them and work with them. Had they happened at a different time in the flight plan, would have doomed the crew. So deep down in them, they knew that this could all go wrong.
And you had to get, as they would have said in flying, you've got to get all your ducks in a row.
You've got to get your mind on the job. And it is said that the best astronauts don't have imagination, because they don't like to imagine things going wrong. It's entirely the reverse. They imagine everything going wrong, but they have the attitude, as you say, to keep their ducks in a row, to keep their mind on the job, and know what to do next.
Because these days they call that mindfulness. And I think they're even teaching that to kids in schools, that you are concentrating on what's happening right now, and you are not getting fixated upon stuff that might happen. You know that you might have to have a plan to deal with something bad, but it's not part of your present reality.
I think one of his sons was asked, were you worried when you were flying out to fly to the moon? Were you worried that things would go wrong and he wouldn't come back home? And they said, no. If anything went wrong, we know we'd figured it out.
That's great. That is the greatest testament of all. Okay, we know about the launch, and we know, even if we're one of the 4th who were not around, we know about the landing because they were the two most covered parts. We're aware of the sheer force of launching the Saturn V, the fact that the ground vibrated, all the rest of it, all of those people whose eyes turned skyward as the rocket lifted up. And of course we know about the landing because we've seen that final touchdown sequence, the landing sequence that was brilliantly powerful, the fact that it was touch and go could have gone very well. What we don't know much about is what that mission was like in between those two events. What was it like? How routine was it? What was the vibe?
Well, it worked very well. There were no major problems between this was the 3rd time that a crew had left the Earth. And there were no major problems, and they seemed very relaxed when they were heading towards the moon. I mean, I can't get my head around this in the sense that the Apollo command module is smaller than the studio, and they were in it for 3 days, going between the Earth and the moon, which is a heck of a distance, and the Earth's getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and you're just in this small capsule. The mentality and the control you have to be okay with that, to be okay in a small capsule so far from Earth, you've got to have your head together.
But it's almost like there used to be people who would perform stunts and they'd appear on television. They'd get themselves buried in a coffin. And you remember some of these people, it was almost like a circus act. They get themselves buried underground in a coffin with only an air pipe and try and endure that. Now, I used to watch those things on television and think I would probably freak out after the first half an hour. It's a strange analogy, but in a similar way, we guys in a tiny capsule for a period of days doing something stressful and important. The pressure, it doesn't matter what degree of the right stuff they all had, and we know what they did. The pressure must have been enormous.
Yeah, particularly since they all know that at some stage, should they get into lunar orbit, that 2 of them are going to leave the 3rd one on its own, and they are going to try the first landing. So that there is this event coming up, getting closer and closer, in the relative tranquility of the translunar coast. These were remarkable people, and of course supported by so many people down on the ground. Not only the flight directors, the mission controllers, but also on a full floor of the mission control, a huge computer. The best they had at the time was doing all the calculations, because this couldn't be done on board. You didn't sort of send Apollo and rely on its onboard computer to work out which direction it should be pointing and when should it be firing its rocket motor. This was all done on the ground, and the summary was spoken up to them so that they can type in the coordinates. And of course you need mathematicians to do that. And it was complicated maths at the time. Where is the moon when you set off? Where will be the moon when you arrive? Will it be in the right place for you to fire your rocket? Which direction do you have to point your rocket motor? How long do you fire it for? Then you want to circularize the orbit. When do you do it? At what time do you want to separate the LEM from the command module in order to begin your descent? Is the lighting condition okay on the landing site? In fact, it was so finely tuned that in order to land on the Sea of Tranquility, when the sun was at an angle between, I think, 9 and 15 degrees, which is best for seeing the relief as you come down to land, that dictated the very minute of liftoff on planet Earth.
Really?
It was all hung together. So had they not launched on that time, they'd have had to launch, I think, a month later to reproduce the lighting conditions on the landing site. So this was all incredibly mathematically accurate. And the people on the ground told them all these things, when to do this, when to do that. They, of course, had they lost all communication with the Earth, which was a possibility, they knew the shortcuts and the procedures to get back to Earth. But they certainly couldn't have done the landing if they'd lost contact with the Earth.
People were watching this mission because of its importance, because of what it was from Tokyo to Tallahassee in real time. Perhaps the first event of its kind to be scrutinized and pored over and watched like this. Now, when you've got an audience like that, and there is the huge potential for stuff going wrong, perhaps terminally so, there has to be a plan for how you present that to the public. You know, you cut the video feed, you stop telling people about it when things start going wrong, and then you come back with an ordered way of presenting the situation to the public. What were those plans like?
Oh, there were lots of plans. In fact, during the mission, particularly during liftoff, NASA was worried about Russia trying to sabotage the thing.
Sabotage?
They had a particular person on, I think it was Poppy Northcote, who was one of the few women in the firing room at Cape Canaveral, whose job it was to look out for erroneous radio transmissions, possibly from Soviet subs or ships offshore, who were trying to interfere or block the radio commands to the Saturn V rocket. That was taken as a possibility. They had rumours that they might have tried that on Apollo 8. So they were aware that there was spying going on, and there was all these could be some of these activities. But I think you're alluding to the fact that what happens if they couldn't get home? If there was a ship blown up, if Armstrong or everyone was stuck on the surface?
Well, there had to be a plan, and very likely, I don't know what the statistical likelihood of that is, but fairly high, I would have thought. So the plan needed to be very polished.
It was... Nobody wanted an astronaut to die lying in front of an audience. So they had contingencies to cut through, to go to something else if there was a problem.
And Nixon was the president. Had Nixon recorded an address?
No, he'd written an address. You know, there is... it included actually the obligatory phrase, touch the face of God, which Reagan used after the Challenger accident. Yes, but they did say that there was a speech that was written, and you can see it's available, you know, that they know there is no hope of rescue, and they are consigned to their fate, knowing that, you know, they've done something magnificent, and their life was not in vain. Well, the question, of course, is Michael Collins coming back on his own. That would have been absolutely terrible.
Well, not only for the public, but for him.
Yeah, for him to come back and leave his crewmates on the ground. There was nothing he could do. Had they had a problem landing and they'd smashed part of the rocket, if they were tilted too long, too much, they couldn't have come back, and there was nothing they could do, and they were aware of that. There were no cyanide capsules. Why would there be?
I always assumed there would have been a method.
The method was to take your helmet off, really, and, you know, in the vacuum.
So if you're going to go, that's an astonishing way to go.
They only had fuel for a few days, air for a few days, because the budget on mass was so tight that if you estimated it going down to the near surface and then taking back off to dock with the command module was going to take you 3 days, you'd give yourself 3 days, 3 hours of work. You didn't want any more than that. So that was finite. I mean, they faced that with a rescue mission, a precursor mission to Apollo 11, when Apollo 9 flew around, you know, testing the whole system in Earth orbit. There was a time when an astronaut got into the lunar module and backed off 100 miles from the command module. And that was the first time an astronaut was in orbit in a spacecraft that could not re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. There was no way, if he could not dock with his friends back, he was doomed, because that craft was not to never feature. So they had that problem with Apollo 9. But it was a problem which faced all the landers. It's amazing they got everybody there and everybody back.
Okay. One of the last questions I'll ask you, and this has been, we could talk another hour and then another hour after that on this, is it was an amazing achievement, and there was always the possibility that it would go wrong. If it had gone wrong, how soon, presumably the plan was to try again, but how soon would they have been able to do that?
A couple of months later. They had the capsules, the equipment, the training. If Apollo 11 had resulted in the death of the crew, Apollo 12 would have gone on at the same time. You see, there was a different attitude in those days. Today, if it happened today, there would be major inquiries. It would take probably years to get back on track, if at all. In those days, these guys had the attitude of a test pilot. When you were a test pilot flying in the 1950s, all these new craft, people died on the time. It was a regular occurrence. And you'd have the funeral, you'd have the wake. The next day, there'd be others back in the capsule, back in the cockpit, taking off similar airplanes.
So there's no health and safety culture. That's the difference.
It was different. That was the case. The thing that struck me, I remember one quote from the book, most of all. It's that when the 3 Apollo 1 astronauts died, and this showed the resilience they had, and Armstrong said that gave them the opportunity to redesign, to make the craft better, and it enabled them to get to the moon during the Kennedy deadline. They said Neil Armstrong said Apollo 1 gave them extra time, and then he paused and said, "We didn't want it."
Wow. We're going to Mars. Last question, and you can only speculate about this, but it's worth speculating about. Will it feel the same in any way?
Probably for the new generation. The generations that are coming will. Which will of course be very different because the time delays are much, much longer at Mars. But I hope so. And perhaps the first Martian is alive today and going to school. But I think one of the things I draw from Apollo 11 is that subsequent generations have to a certain degree failed the next generation. We have not given them a similar event. We have lived through Apollo 11. We'll never forget it. What have subsequent generations lived through of a similar magnitude? We have not given it to them. I hope that sooner or later, a forthcoming generation will look on the moon, the Mars landing, as we do look on the moon landing.
What a great point at which to leave this hour. Let's sell some more books. What's the title? How do we get it?
It's called Apollo 11, The Inside Story. In all good bookshops, on Amazon, and if you want, buy 2.
What for a friend? Maybe a couple for Christmas, who knows? David Whitehouse, it was very good of you to personally come in here and meet face to face. Thank you very much for that. The Unexplained across the UK on Talk Radio, around the world too. Don't forget my website, theunexplained.tv, which is a one-stop shop for this show. Something special we're doing tonight. We're looking back on 50 years, very nearly, since Apollo 11 put man on the moon. And we have various people to talk with this evening. We'll start with James Burke. Then you're going to hear the voice of Edgar Mitchell, a man who walked on the moon on Apollo 14. And then you'll hear the voice of David Chudwin. Now, David Chudwin was the student reporter, aged, I think, 18 or 19 at the time, who was given special permission to go out and cover the Apollo 11 launch itself. Very exciting time. Some reflections from him that you won't have heard over these 50 years from anybody else. He's only coming out with those now. He's written a book. We'll talk with him later this hour. But let's start with the man who for many was the face and remains the face and voice of the Apollo 11 broadcast coverage, certainly for the BBC, but probably in all of Europe. Now, America had Walter Cronkite, and we had James Burke, a man who later became famous for his great documentary series. James Burke cut his teeth on Apollo 11. And a couple of years ago, I actually spoke with him about the Apollo program, about his career, and how that was affected materially by the Apollo 11 job as it became for him. So let's hear the words of James Burke, talking not only about Apollo 11, but the entire Apollo program.
Well, at the beginning of Apollo, first of all, I was on Tomorrow's World before Apollo, and again, once another example of the way I fell backwards into things. The man running Tomorrow's World at the time, now dead, I came back from holiday and he said, "What do you know about rockets?" And I said, "Pointing one end, fire the other." And he said, "No, what do you really know?" And I said, "You just heard it." And he said, "Well, then you're in deep doo-doo, because you're going to be covering Apollo." And I said, why? And he said, well, because the bosses asked me if there was anybody on my team who knew about space. And I said, yes, his name's Burke and he wrote the book. And I said, why did you say that? And he said, I couldn't be seen not to know. So you got the job, so do something. So I phoned NASA and said, send 1,000 books. And I spent weeks mugging it all up. And I stayed one flight plan page ahead of the audience for about the first 3 missions. But after that, if you do, I mean, as you know, all broadcasters do this, you do enough hard work, you learn it, and you know what it's all about. And NASA were very, very positive. I mean, if you turned up knowing something about it, they did everything for you. It's the guys who came in saying, I don't know and I don't care, who's this boring astronaut I have to interview? They didn't help them at all. But we got all the help we could ever possibly want from NASA. And it made our job easier. And if we needed an astronaut, one was provided. So that was a marvellous period of my life and of broadcasting for me too.
I remember seeing some video of you with Jim Lovell on 16. You were close to the launch site of Apollo, as close as you could get to the launch pad of Apollo 16, which I think was the last. Was it the last Apollo? 17 was the last. Okay, it was the penultimate mission. And there you are talking to Jim Lovell like he's your best pal.
Well, I had known Jim for a long time, you see, because I met him first in 66, 67. So I'd known him for 4 or 5 years, and also, I had also done 2 or 3 programs only about him, because he was on the one that blew up Apollo 13. Remember the one that blew up on the way to the moon? And he was made available for people who wished to interview him afterwards, and nobody from the American networks asked. And I never thought we had a chance, and I said, well, we'd like to. And they said, okay, you got him. And I was able to spend several hours with him just talking about that mission. Marvellous guy, still a marvellous guy.
Big statuesque man, wasn't he?
Very, very. And there was a lovely touch when Tom Hanks did the Apollo 13 film, which was very good and very accurate, about that mission, and played Jim Lovell. In the film, they're picked up after splashdown, they're brought back to the carrier's deck, and as they come out, everybody's cheering, and they meet everybody, starting with the captain of the carrier, who's in captain's uniform, and who's Jim Lovell. They gave him the job of playing the role of the captain of the ship.
Oh, how lovely is that? That is I didn't know that. I saw that. I've seen the movie several times.
Well, that's him. He's the captain.
Apollo 13 I wanted to talk about because it was the first time, well, apart from before the Apollo mission started properly in one of the proving missions, of course, there was the terrible fire in which Gus Grissom is the only name I can remember from the team of 3 astronauts who sadly perished in the most awful way in a test because they used oxygen inside and that was a terrible thing. So the public first became acquainted that things can actually go wrong. But Apollo 13, I was a boy, but I remember vividly, not so much the specific programs. Yes, I remember your presence, but I remember the feeling because I'd been brought up on Thunderbirds and, and reading books about how great this all was. Yeah, I had an Action Man with a little space capsule. I've still got it. So I loved all of this. And suddenly, in my little life, came the notion that this might end very badly, and that's a really hard thing for a kid to take on board. And we turned to you to explain what was going to happen and what we hoped the outcome might be. What was that like?
Well, we approached it as you would, as any broadcaster would. I mean, first of all, you had to be right on top of what was going on, and you had to be, there was no way that you could not understand what was going on. So an enormous amount of research was going on behind it all. But we also prepared a 1-hour obituary in case. And, when they came back into what's called Earth interface, where the spacecraft hits the top of the atmosphere on its way back to Earth and becomes incandescent for a number of minutes, there is a period of up to 4 or 5 minutes in which they're out of radio contact, so you don't know if they're alive or dead. If the explosion had damaged the heat shield on the capsule, they were dead. If it hadn't, they would come out. And they were a minute late. So for a minute, I was thinking about how we segue into the obituary. And then they came out. And we went into the splashdown and all that stuff, and everybody cheering. And
well, in fact, the world said that.
Yes. So you're always operating at 2 levels at once. The emotional level, where you're, as you know, as a broadcaster, your palm is sweaty and you're trying to make sure you don't make any silly mistakes, and you're listening to them while you're talking to the audience and blah, blah, blah. That's the emotional stuff. And on the professional side, you know that you've got to show up in the next 5 seconds because he's going to say something, and you know that you may have to go into an obituary and all that kind of professional stuff. So Apollo was two things at once. It was a tremendous emotional ride, and it was a wonderful test of one's professionalism, because there was nothing worse than talking while an astronaut was saying something in the moon. And you had one ear, half your brain, saying shut up as soon as you hear him say anything, and structuring your sentences so that if you had to, you could shut up with 1 second to go. You've done this yourself, I'm sure. And even if there were pictures from the moon, you couldn't see their mouth.
But you got those little beeps though, didn't you?
No, well, sort of. No, I think later on they didn't do the beeps, and they did the beeps only from so you didn't know that the astronaut was about to say something vital. And thank God, when Armstrong went down the ladder and put his foot on the soil and said, "That's one small step for man," thank God I was either breathing in or taking a cup of coffee or something and said nothing. Can you imagine talking over that, you know?
You know, my parents, I remember them being glued to all of the Apollo coverage. But the first real memory, the thing that hit me in the solar plexus, was that Apollo 13 thing, because we all had to have explained to us, and you did the explaining. And I seem to dimly remember that some of the gambits that they were coming up with up there for self-made solutions, because they had to improvise with whatever they had to allow the air to be scrubbed and cleaned for long enough for them to get back. And it was also in the movie, of course, but I remember it vividly from that. And you actually made, I think, some of those things, or you demonstrated it
in the studio. And what we did, we stayed online, well, not online because we weren't online in those days, but we stayed in telephonic constant contact with NASA. And as they were doing things, we were getting somebody in the studio, model makers and things, to copy what they were doing so that we could say, this is what they're doing, and then show it to the audience. You know, with the right kind of talent around, you can do anything like that.
But at any stage in that return, and there was that swinging shot around the moon that would propel them back on a natural trajectory, as if they were born on a tide. Yeah. At any stage, that craft could have split apart, they could have suffocated, anything could have happened. And I guess you faced that whole thing of having to explain, well, nobody who signs up for the Apollo program does so without knowing that it may end like this, and it's the peak of most of their lives, of all of their lives.
We ran the whole thing with an obituary ready.
At all times.
At all times, because, as you say, it could have happened at any time. If they could have not come round the moon. I mean, they could have crashed on the other side of the moon. We wouldn't know until they just didn't turn up. So, as I said, you were running everything at the emotional level and at the professional level at the same time.
And what was the feeling like? Because I can remember what the feeling was like in our little house in Liverpool, when that silence on re-entry passed and they were spotted, the camera zoomed in. I think it was one of the first to be covered in colour from what I recall.
Yeah, coloured shoots.
Some, awful American NTSC picture quality, but you could see it. And you knew that they were coloured shoots, and there they were. And it was almost like that first moment on the moon where you had a bunch of people around the world about to turn blue who could breathe again. It was like that.
I'm afraid my reaction at the time was I went from the emotional to professional, because, as soon as the shoots were visible, they were alive, and you had to say to yourself, if they're alive, how do I say, what do I say next, and what's happening next, and how do we fill in until they're in the water, blah, blah, blah. So really, you're too busy thinking about how to do the job.
And the real risk and the danger of that is to open your mouth and say something that completely trivializes or cheapens or undermines this amazing thing that you're seeing. I guess finding the right words is immensely difficult.
I suppose so. Yes. I don't know. That's something I don't like to think about.
Because if you think about it, the genie might be out of the bottle, yes. I guess. Okay. There are people who say, and I interviewed one of them recently, that the moon landings never happened. What do you think about all of that? Because they're saying that today, and they are allegedly, some of them, coming up with new evidence.
No, I think that's a load of rubbish. I mean, conspiracy theory is usually rubbish. The simple way to work out whether there was a moon landing or not is to measure how long it took the signal to get from wherever it came from. And that old business about, that movie, I forget what it was called, Capricorn 1, where what they did was actually set up something in the Arizona desert and pretend that
you were in Pasadena or something.
Yeah. Well, the simple answer, and the story is blown when an engineer says, hang on, this signal can't possibly get here that fast. They're on Mars. So there are very simple ways to find out that what went on the moon actually happened.
But what about all the list of factors that people still cite to me in interviews, that the flag apparently flutters on the lunar surface, and by the way, in the photographs, where are the stars?
Pass. I mean, it didn't flutter. And you can't see the stars because that's the camera not seeing the stars, not you, and you're not there to see the stars.
So the camera was just not registered.
It was not good enough.
And the flag was on a spring, I think.
And the flag was on a spring, and the other thing was the flag fluttered. The flag fluttered also every time the thing took off to go away. And when there was a blast of exhaust plume, that would flutter anything. So I don't think, no, that's nonsense.
If you'd been given the chance back then, because they tell me that the optimal age to go into space is not 25, as most things seem to be. It's a little older because of your bones and what have you. And so apparently to be a little older is a good thing when you're talking about going into space, which is why people like Nigel Hembest, my friend, the astronomer, is paying Richard Branson to be one of the first to go up there. And I think he's in his 60s. He probably hate me for saying that, but he is. Do you regret the fact that perhaps you never had the chance, and you haven't lived, and neither have I, in a generation where spaceflight is routine?
Of course I'd love to go into space. I did some time on the Vomit comet, so I know what it's like. It's tremendously exciting. But I'd like to have gone into space and then come back to broadcasting. Because broadcasting is much more interesting than going into space.
You could broadcast from space. You could have had the best of both worlds.
I'd still like to come back.
You had your own series, I know we're leaping backwards and forwards a little chronologically, called the Burke Special. And that was a marvellous opportunity to take science and cool stuff and look into the future for a light entertainment. I think it was Thursday evening audience, so it might have been Wednesday evening. But it was, I remember it being a bit of a highlight of the week because it was entertaining. And I remember you did all sorts of stuff that people hadn't done before. If I could transport you back to a time in your life that was the best, and a time that we all have times in our lives where we think, well, that's the essence of me, and that was my absolute zenith, my peak. It might be now, for all I know. But if I could take you back to a time, where would you go?
I think probably the landing on the moon. I think that was the greatest test of what I can do, and the greatest opportunity to express in terminology that required a certain kind of ability, and the ability above all to work, as I said earlier, at two levels at once, the emotional and the professional. So all in all, I think that was probably the best time. After getting married, that is, of course.
Exactly. I'm glad you said that, and I'm sure there's at least one person who's going to be very, very pleased you said that. Right answer, as they say. What about our coverage of the exploration of Mars, which is nearer than most people appreciate? If you listen to people like the guy who runs Mars One, Bas Lansdorp, or you talk to NASA, this is all happening within the span of the next 15 or 20 years, beginning to happen. How should we cover that? How should it be covered? Should it be special programs like you used to do, or should we be filtering it into the media right now?
Well, I think probably filtering it into the media right now. I have to say, however, that my experience with Apollo and my life since then leads me to believe that travel to Mars, or indeed any other planet in the solar system, is a gigantic waste of money. I mean, what we learn from traveling to Mars, or Ceres, or Pluto, that substantially improves the quality of human life, intellectual and physical, I don't know. I mean, going to the moon, I think was important for society because it was the first. It will never be repeated. There will never be another first in space. The next first in space is when somebody contacts us from out there. And until then, I think we have so many problems to deal with on the planet that we would spend our money better doing those things. Above all, stuff in Earth orbit, for example, from which you can do many, 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 many good things.
And yet NASA are talking about the moon at the moment as being a kind of way station to go elsewhere.
Well, that's NASA's raison d'etre. I mean, without space, NASA doesn't exist. So, of course they're working on that. I mean, that's called trying to persuade your political friends to help you. And I don't blame them, but I do think it's a waste of money.
Do you believe that there's a secret space program? Has that ever been mentioned to you?
I wouldn't know what would be secret about it.
Well, work for defense organizations at the lowest level, and at the highest level perhaps work with other civilizations beyond this.
Well, I don't think a civilizations beyond us is likely to be around. The rest of it, I think, is tons of stuff. I mean, if you look at the early development in stealth, the stealth programs are going on for years without anybody knowing about them. So I'm sure that advanced projects are in the hopper right now. External civilizations? No, I don't think so. I don't think that's in anybody's control or gift. it's going to turn out and happen, and when it does, alas, I probably won't be here.
And I hope his career continues for many decades to come. The remarkable, the immortal James Bond, talking about the Apollo years and a little bit about his career too from a recent interview. This is the Unexplained Apollo 11 Moon Landing Special. Hope you're enjoying this on this last night of June as we go into the month where we will actually celebrate the 50th anniversary. Okay, coming next, a man who actually set foot on the moon. Not on Apollo 11, but on Apollo 14, Edgar Mitchell, who was one of the more vocal astronauts. You know, some of them didn't speak a great deal, particularly Neil Armstrong didn't say much about it over the years and didn't do many interviews. Edgar Mitchell did, and a few years before his recent death, I had the chance to speak with him about what it was like to set foot on the grey dust of the lunar surface.
So I enlisted in the Navy, and got an officer's commission as a naval officer, and then went to Navy flight school. And I flew in the Korean War, was a Navy squadron, and then it so happened I had to finish out my obligated service to the Navy. So I was coming back aboard an aircraft carrier from the Pacific in 1957 on October the 4th when Sputnik went up. And I realized at that moment, on the way back on the carrier, that life had just changed, so we had just become, because humans would follow robot spacecraft quickly, we had just become a spacefaring civilization, or entering into a spacefaring world. And I wanted to be a part of that. So I came back. I was coming back as a test pilot. I was a pretty good pilot, so I was coming back as a test pilot. I did a couple of years of that, and I realized to be selected into the astronaut program because the fellows that were already being selected for the original 7, they had a little more jet time, a little more experience, and were a few years older than me. And I realized that to compete, I would have to have more education. So I was able to successfully ask for and get sent to back to school, and I got my doctorate from MIT. And shortly after that, I was assigned to Edwards Air Force Base, where I was both an instructor and a student. And I was selected into the astronaut program in 1966 from Edwards Air Force Base, and was selected into the Apollo group of astronauts.
You make it sound really easy, but I guess that was a really difficult progression, or was it?
Well, it went pretty smoothly for me. A lot of people that didn't make it, that wanted to make it. There were 1,900 applicants when our group was selected, and 1 out of 100 got selected. There were only 19 of us selected.
So what do you think that you had that they didn't? Is it what they call over there intestinal fortitude? I think that's what it was.
A part of that, and desire, drive, and I scored pretty high on all sorts of tests, so not a dummy, and very much devoted to the mission, and so it all worked for me.
And at that stage when you were selected, at what stage did you become aware that you were going to be sent on a big mission?
Well, I'll have to tell you our protocol a little bit. When we were first selected in, the 19 of us that went into our group, we were asked to choose a technical specialty in the space industry that we wanted to serve our time in, kind of an apprentice job. I, along with Fred Hayes, Apollo 13 astronaut and a shuttle astronaut, Fred Hayes chose to be associated with the lunar module and help build the lunar module. And so we were the astronaut representatives to go to Grumman Aircraft Factory on Long Island in New York and be the astronaut representative during the building and testing of the first lunar module.
So in other words, you had an input into the whole thing?
Yeah. And it was just a choice. I thought that would give me a little closer to going to the moon, which it did. Then when we finished that assignment with delivery of the first lunar module, flight test lunar module to Cape Kennedy for testing on Apollo 9, we were freed up to start into the crew cycle. So I got selected then as backup crew, which was essentially a training assignment. Backup crew on Apollo 10. Fred went to Apollo 11. Now, our procedure at that point in time was 3 flights later, if you served a backup position, which they used as a training session, then 3 flights later you were eligible to become a prime crew. Well, that meant I would be eligible for prime crew on Apollo 13 and Fred on 14.
Okay.
However, I served my backup on Apollo 10 with Gordon Cooper, and he wanted to retire from the program shortly after that assignment. And Alan Shepard, who had been grounded for a medical problem for a number of years, Meniere's syndrome, an inner ear problem, had that fixed, and he wanted to take Gordon's place, which he was selected to take the place. However, headquarters in Washington said, Alan, you have been grounded and not training for a number of years. Best you take a little more training time with your crew. And so we switched missions with Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes and that crew. They had 14, but they took 13, got the bad machine, and we took 14, got the good machine, and flew the Apollo 13 mission.
Boy, they got the bad machine and how. But of course, you were training up for 14 while that drama, which I remember when I was a little boy following, we all did around the world, the sense of drama about that thing. Obviously, you'd have been seeing that as somebody training up for the next mission. When you watched the dilemma of the ground crew and when you watched the fate of those guys up there, how did that make you feel?
Well, you see, because we were the most experienced, I was the most experienced lunar module pilot on the ground at that point, in training, ready to fly. I was went to the simulators and was practicing in the simulators everything they had to do in space with the damaged machine, because the lunar module was the lifeboat, the recovery vessel to get them back. So I practiced in the simulator everything they had to do before they had to do it.
And Edgar, was it just like the movie where you had to work day and night, really, practicing with this thing, and the air filter was the big problem, wasn't it, to be able to filter out the carbon dioxide?
We let the engineers work on that one. I was more concerned with the flight maneuvers they'd have to do with the lunar module, and that was what I did. Now, it so happens, if you remember the Apollo 13 movie, Ken Mattingly was a command module pilot.
Sure, got it.
On Apollo 13 that got bumped because he had been exposed to measles by one of the astronauts' children. So he and I were the two senior astronauts in the chain in line there during the Apollo 13 recovery, and we both were in the simulators and working on the problems of how do we get them home. And so we both eventually then went on to go to the moon in a different flight than we were initially posed. I was supposed to go on 13, went on 14. He was supposed to go on 13, went on 16.
Did you feel, I'm looking for the word, but did you feel lucky that you avoided that experience of going on 13? You know what I'm saying?
Well, I have to look at it first. I have to look at it that way because I got to land on the moon and do the first science mission on the moon without a shuttle. So, yes, in my career, that was a lucky thing to do. Fred Hayes stayed on, then flew shuttle flights after that because he was one of the test pilots to test the early shuttle spacecraft. But he didn't get to land on the moon, and I did. Even we were close buddies, very close buddies then. But I consider myself very lucky. I was able to help he and the crew get back safely to Earth. But then I got to take over and do the first science on the mission and help on the moon. We just called it Apollo 14 instead of 13.
What a tremendous responsibility you had, though, when you were practicing those maneuvers. You had to absolutely get it right, because the margin for error for those guys coming back on 13 was so slim, wasn't it?
Yeah, we didn't have much room for error, but we had thought about, okay, we might have to use the lunar module as a lifeboat, but nobody ever really took that too seriously. But we thought about it, and we had the protocol in place. We just had to practice and make sure we could do it, and that's what I was doing in the simulator during that period. And Ken was doing in the command module simulator. We're learning how to bring the command module back through the atmosphere with virtually no power, with limited amount of power, because they had lost virtually all of their power during the explosion.
I mean, it was absolutely miraculous to be able to use the lunar module to do as much as it did. Did anybody really believe that it was capable of that? You made it do things it wasn't designed to do.
Oh yes, it was That was the initial backup plan was the lunar module could be used to move the whole stack around in case of emergency, but it was never taken very seriously. It wasn't a high priority item, but it was in the back of the mind of the designers and the planning back in the early days.
The world, including myself as a little schoolboy in Liverpool, England, Edgar, breathed a massive sigh of relief when those guys came home. You know, a lot of us didn't believe that it was possible. I remember my parents waiting with bated breath as we watched the TV pictures here. When you saw that, when the guys came back, having been through all of that...
All of it were very delighted that we pulled it off.
Well, yes. A fantastic achievement, Edgar, but I wonder if in your mind you wouldn't be human if you didn't have thoughts... You were going on 14, maybe you didn't want to do it, or you were afraid at that stage, perhaps?
No. Felt very lucky and exhilarated to get to go ahead and do it. We spent a lot of time with the factories, with the people who were building the lunar module, doing quality control, doing encouragement. Hey guys, our finances are on the line. Let's do this right. Don't make a mistake, please. Let's don't repeat 13. All of those things were in our minds, and we were very confident that we weren't going to have a second blowout of the same path.
But I suppose what goes through your mind on a philosophical level, tell me if it does, is the fact that you're doing the greatest thing that any human being could possibly do, and if anything did go wrong and you were to die doing it, it's a horrible thought, but an interesting one, then it's a fantastic way to go. There's probably no better way to go if you're going to.
Well, Howard, very frankly, all of us were professionals. We were test pilots, we were military officers. Nothing that we did in our military career or in our flight career wasn't without its hazards and its risks. But we knew this was a test mission. But we realized that the risk was worth it. The reward of doing it was worth the risk of taking it. And so we didn't dwell on those things. If you dwelled on them too much, you were wasting your time. You were losing time when you ought to be thinking about other things. And most of us were more disciplined than to get into a worrisome state. Now, there are a few guys who are a little nervous knowledge, but not many of us are.
Well, I think I'd have been with those guys. You sound very calm about the whole thing. I'd have been very, very scared, but I can understand with your background, having, flown test flights and that kind of stuff, you were just used to this. This was just an extension of routine for you.
Exactly. We had trained for this. I mean, we've been military pilots, we've been test pilots, we've been in war. These sort of hazardous things were, I wouldn't say we welcomed them all the time, because that wasn't the case, but we were used to having to deal with the emotion of it.
Here's a question that you've probably heard from people you meet on the bus. If you travel by bus there, people you've met on planes, school kids when you've done NASA education things, which I guess you've done as well. So I'm asking it too now. What's it like to go to the moon?
What more can an explorer want than to go where humans have never been, gather the data, take pictures, bring back samples, and tell the people about it? That's what explorers do. And that's what we were when we went to the moon. We were test pilots that were turned into explorers.
But an amazing experience as you step out of that craft on the lunar surface. I cannot even begin to, and I will never be able to, sadly, although I'd love to, imagine what that feels like.
Well, it's kind of it's really an aha experience. It's, wow, look at all of that. And of course, the moon, when you first land on it and look out there, looks like any desert, virtually like any desert. Although sand dunes look a little different than pockmarked craters, nevertheless the surface is barren of any vegetation. There's no oxygen or air on the surface. So it's a very barren, gray-brown surface, kind of like a desert. And this was what struck us as the fact we knew it was a barren place, but it is really very desolate, very barren. But it was exhilarating to be the first human to land at that particular spot. And we left the remnants of equipment there that will be there forever, or some of it will be there forever. So again, what more can an explorer want than to go to where humans have never been, gather data, take pictures, bring back samples, and tell people what you've done?
The late Edgar Mitchell, I spoke with him back in 2010 for my podcast at theunexplained.tv, talking about not only the technical achievement of walking on the moon, but what it's like to step on that dust and look back at Earth. And as he said, it was indeed a wow moment. Now a great story, and you can hear more of this on my website, theunexplained.tv. But here's some of the main points from David Chudwin. Now, back in 1969, David's in his 60s now, but back in 1969, David Chudwin was a teenager. And by various means that you will hear, he was able to get himself accredited to become a reporter and covered the Apollo 11 launch. Here's David Chudwin.
We staked out an area in front of the bleachers that were set up for the dignitaries. So we were about 50 yards or so in front of them, and watched the launch preparations from there. There were loudspeakers with the voice of Jack King, who was the NASA public affairs official. He had a very distinctive voice. If you hear any tapes of the launch, you can definitely make out Jack King. And he gave commentary along the way of each of the different milestones before the launch. Now, you have to remember that this date and time, July 16th at 9:32 a.m., had been set months before. And we had a lot of concern about whether it would make it off on time, because there was a long history of postponements and scrubs of space launches due to mechanical problems, weather problems, things like that. As I told you before, I only had a week off for my job. And so it was really important that the rocket get off, because a scrub would involve 2 days, and the most we could stay there for would be 2 scrubs.
Right, and you'd have to go back to the clothing store.
Right, exactly, which would have been very anticlimactic.
Oh, God, well, again, luck was with you.
So the countdown, NASA has a odd word for normal called nominal. So the countdown was very nominal, and everything went very, very smoothly. So we were standing there, and the rocket gets down to the famous T-minus 10, 9, 8, ignition sequence start. And at the base of the rocket, we can see, even though we're 3 miles away, because this thing was so huge, we could see the rocket. There was a little ball of flame at the base of the rocket with ignition. And then huge sheets of flame and smoke shoot out from either side of the rocket. There were flame deflectors that sent out the fire and smoke to either side, so it wouldn't destroy the launch pad itself. And so the rocket is there, and it just sits there with flames and smoke and fumes pouring out of it. And I started to get a little bit worried. It was just sitting there, and it seemed like it was sitting there forever. I had a brief wonder twinge of whether this thing was actually going to rise off the launch pad. So very, very slowly it rises up and clears the launch tower. But it seemed like forever, but apparently it was about 10 seconds for it from the ignition to actually clear the launch tower. And meanwhile, all this time it's silent, because light travels faster than sound. But as it starts to clear the tower, we hear this tremendous, unbelievable roar. Some of the adjectives have been like that it's like 100 locomotives, but it's this loud, crackling sound that physically assaulted us. It was like beating on my chest, the sound.
So a very visceral experience.
Right. The ground was shaking. There was vibration. And as it rose up, we could actually feel the heat from the rocket.
That's astonishing.
It's anybody who's actually seen in person a Saturn V launch knows that it's unique. Very different than a shuttle launch, because with the shuttle, there was ignition. Once the solid rockets went off in the shuttle, it would zoom right out of there. But this was very slow getting off the launch pad, and it made for a very, very exciting, nerve-wracking launch.
And when it appeared to be going well, when it was off the pad and going up, I presume among the people who were in the know there was a tremendous, the people around you, tremendous feeling of relief.
Yeah, I mean, there was a cheering and a roar of the crowd, but the roar from the rocket was so big that it drowned out the cheering from the crowd. It took about a couple minutes or so for the rocket to gain speed, and eventually all we were able to see was a point of light in the sky. And the rocket noise started to dissipate, and we could hear the cheering from the people in the grandstands.
And once it disappears from view, and once it is confirmed as being, heading out of our atmosphere and on its way, what's that like? Is it anticlimactic?
No, I think it was very, very exciting because there were certain milestones to this mission, and one of the key milestones was getting the Apollo spacecraft into Earth orbit, where it could be checked out before going to the moon. And so there was a sense of relief and also of joy that it had actually gotten off the ground on time at the same moment that it had been preordained months ago. And my friend and I were absolutely thrilled that we were able to see an on-time launch and be able to experience this without having had to go back to our normal life and missing it. That would have been anticlimactic.
And of course, there were no cell phones, there was no internet. To file your copy to the newspapers, because you were representing, 500 of them, I think, or whatever, did you have to keep running for phones?
Yes, although you see the news cycles then were a lot slower than now. There's a 24-hour news cycle, and things are reported instantaneously. It was kind of a slower world then. So what we did after the launch is we'd been up since 4:30 in the morning, so we went back to the motel. And actually what I did, and my friend did, we took a swim in a swimming pool. And I kind of imagined myself as I was floating in the swimming pool, how the astronauts were floating in space at the same time. And so I didn't go and write the story until later that afternoon. And there were no, there was no internet. There were only two ways to get the story in. One could either use a teletype machine, which we didn't have because, again, this was a low-budget operation, or we could dictate the stories. When I put that in the book, my editor, who was in her 40s, didn't understand what I meant by dictate. So I had to explain that I would write the story on a manual typewriter that they had at the press center, and then I would call the newspaper on a rotary dial phone, and I would read the text of the story word by word to someone at the other end who was sitting at a typewriter and would type it out.
I was trained to do this. I'm a radio guy, but I was trained by newspaper people who forced me to understand the principles of writing for newspapers before they'd allow me near a microphone. So that's what it was like when I started. When I was a kid, you had to dictate copy from wherever you were, and you would say, a man is recovering in hospital following a major crash on whatever road it is. And then you would say at the end of the sentence, point. In the UK, you say point. Then you get to your next few lines out, and when you want to change paragraphs, you'd say par. And then you'd start again. It was a whole different, I don't know what it was like in the States, but it was a whole different way of doing things.
It was very, very similar to that. And in the NASA News Center, they had long cables with manual typewriters on it, and then they had a row of pay rotary telephones that one could use to call in the stories to the newspapers.
Now look, when you dictated your first piece of copy about having been at the launch, gee, for any journalist, whether you've been doing it for 40 years or whether you've been doing it for 4 days, the hardest thing is that first line. Can you remember what was your top line on the first piece of copy?
The Apollo 11 crew is on their way to the moon after a launch witnessed by over 1 million people in the Cape Kennedy area. That's a pretty close paraphrase of it.
Well, I think that's, as we say here, deliciously understated, isn't it? I mean, you don't want to be... A story like that, you've just got to tell the story, I think, and that's what you did. Yeah.
Right. Now, it's interesting what I did with the byline there that shows how I understood the history of it. Usually I used my nickname in the byline, by Dave Chudwin. That one story was the only story where I ever used my full name, by David Chudwin.
And was it noticed? Was the story noticed? Did you get any plaudits for it?
Well, the story was printed on the front page along with some wire copy photos of the launch and the astronauts walking out. But again, with the lack of social media and things like that, I didn't get any real feedback until later in that summer when I was back at the university.
Okay, and was it, I'm sure it was it positive feedback? Were people saying nice things?
Yes, absolutely. So, when we ever came back from our summer breaks to university, people always would say, what did you do over the summer? And so when they asked me that, I would say, I was there when they launched to the moon.
Right, and they would say to you, yes, sure, I was hanging out with Sinatra. I mean, it's the kind of thing that a lot of people would think that you were making it up because it is such an unlikely thing.
Well, even after I got home, I wasn't done with Apollo 11 because on August 13, 1969, the Apollo 11 crew went to New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles all in one day.
Right, and you were part of covering the Chicago parade, weren't you?
Right, and I got to see them again, got up close to them during this parade in Chicago that was viewed by over 1 million people.
I mean, crazy question, but what else can I say? What was that like to be among the throngs of people and to see them, having returned from the moon, parading themselves for the world to see?
Well, it was very very difficult to cover because there was a lot of policemen, and I had my Apollo 11 press pass with me from NASA, and I kept flashing it, and that worked for a while. But eventually, they told me to get back to the sidewalk or they'd arrest me.
And of course, in that day and age, when people told you to do a thing, when police told you to do a thing, people did it.
Right. Well, but I was able to get some nice close-up pictures. Again, some of these are illustrated in the book, and see them again. And it was very striking. The two times I saw them in 1969. The first time as they were walking out in their white spacesuits. And the second time was in this triumphant parade after having just been on the moon 3 or 4 weeks before.
In later years, you got to speak to all of them, I think, or you certainly got to speak to 2 of them.
Right. I had dinner, actually, in different years with Mike Collins and with Buzz Aldrin at a happening called Space Fest, which is an annual gathering of space enthusiasts. And it was very, very thrilling for me to sit down and have dinner with those 2.
And were you able to tell them, by the way, I covered the launch?
Right, yeah. And in fact, I showed them some of the pictures. And it was funny because when I showed the pictures of them coming out to Mike Collins, he pointed to something he was holding in his hand during the walkout that was a paper bag. And he asked me, do you know what this bag is? And he was absolutely astounded that I knew that that's a paper bag in which he carried this fish trophy to present as a gag gift to the pad leader, Gunter Wendt.
Well, that's a nice story. If you read the book, First Man, and I was lucky enough to interview the person who wrote that book, upon which the movie's based on, that gives you a very, very clear sketch of the characters of the people involved in this. And you would have thought that they would pick very similar people to go to the moon, but they weren't, were they? Armstrong, Aldrin, Collins, 3 totally different personalities.
Right, and they were not really a close crew. Collins described them in his book as, quote, amiable strangers, close quote. And they each had a different personality. Neil Armstrong was a perfect choice to be the first man. He was very dignified. He was an incredible pilot. Twice during the space program, during the testing and everything, he saved himself from just seconds from dying. The first time was during Gemini 8. There was a stuck thruster, and he and Dave Scott got into this terrible roll because this thruster was stuck open. They were going around and around and around every second. They were about ready to pass out, which would have been fatal when he was able to disengage the thruster and save them.
You have to have tremendous intestinal fortitude. I remember reading about that to be able to pull that off.
The second incident was he was testing the Lunar Landing Test Vehicle, the LLRV.
Was that the Flying Bedstead?
Yeah, the Flying Bedstead. And it started to crash, and he ejected just fractions of a second before he would have been killed. So NASA knew that he really had the right stuff. I mean, he was very, very cool under pressure. He was very methodical. He was very thoughtful. But I think that this recent movie, First Man, though, did him a disservice. It just showed one part of his character with respect to his feelings and everything after his young daughter died of leukemia. But actually, he was a very happy guy. He laughed a lot. He had a dry sense of humor. And I was privileged to hear him speak a few times, after he came back from the moon. And it was at some events that he was at, although I never personally met him like I did Aldrin and Collins.
Armstrong wasn't exactly a recluse. He went into academia for a while, but he didn't put himself out there like the others did. Aldrin, now I have a soft spot for Aldrin. He was, a big, larger-than-life character, but from what I read about him and hear about him, he did have a propensity to, sometimes as we say here in England, to rub people up the wrong way.
Right, and I think part of that, my observations about him are that there's a good buzz and a bad buzz. The good buzz is charming, is friendly, and is a wonderful proponent for the future of space exploration. The bad buzz is that he can be very focused on certain things like rendezvous and going to Mars, but if someone tries to talk to him about other subjects, he totally ignores them. Also, there were issues in the past where about charging for autographs, where he would charge up to $600 to autograph items.
Okay, well, I must admit I hadn't heard that, and I need to look that up. If that's documented, I guess there was a reason for that, but I don't know what it was. You were saying?
Overall, Aldrin was, I think, given a bum rap in this movie First Man, which showed him as very very awkward and inappropriate. Aldrin was an excellent test pilot. He's a master of computers and rendezvous, and there was a good reason he was chosen for the crew of Apollo 11. At one point, Armstrong was given an opportunity and asked, do you want Buzz Aldrin on your crew? This was when they were first forming the crew, and he said yes, he did, and there was good reason for that.
And it was?
A good reason for that, because he was such a proficient flyer. He was expert with computers, experts with rendezvous, a very good systems engineer.
So kind of, even if you didn't love him, he's the kind of man you want on your team.
Exactly. And Mike Collins, then, is totally different from either of them. Mike Collins is a Renaissance man. He was the first director of the National Air and Space Museum. He's a watercolor artist. He's an author,
and how did he live with being the man who was up there orbiting the moon, while the other two were getting all the coverage down on the surface?
Well, he was at one point he was described as the loneliest person on Earth, because he was like flying behind the moon when everybody else was watching them do the walking on the moon and everything. And he's always said that he never felt that way. That he felt part of the mission, and that and these command module pilots, the astronauts that flew in the command ship and never landed, actually are underappreciated the degree of responsibility they had for the success of the mission. And Collins did an outstanding job in maintaining the command ship and flying it. While Armstrong and Aldrin were on the moon.
And of course, if they'd crashed into the moon, he'd have been coming home alone.
Right. Although NASA really didn't like to talk about it that much. But no, that would have been the case. I mean, that's what made the landing on the moon so scary. To me, the most difficult and exciting part of the entire mission, even more so than the launch, was the landing on the moon, because that was so difficult a piloting task.
David Chudwin, if you put his name into a search engine, you'll see details of his amazing story and also the new book that he's just published all about it. The Unexplained with Howard Hughes, the Apollo 11 50th anniversary special, moves into its final hour. It's after midnight now, and it's time to get some recollections from various people who are connected in their own way with what happened. At the back end of this hour, we'll talk with astronaut Jack Loosman, a real character. He knew a lot probably fellow people will hear his thoughts. Before that, Joe Pappalardo, famous American space writer, works for Popular Mechanics known around the world. He will tell you about the future and the legacy of Apollo 11. But right now, my old friends, and no show like this would be complete without Heather Cooper and Nigel Henbest, veteran, accomplished astronomers. And they're on the line right now too. So, Heather and Nigel, nice to have you on again.
Hi there, Howard.
Great to talk to you, Howard.
So look, I don't know about you, but when you think back at the events of Apollo 11, it doesn't feel like 50 years.
No, it doesn't. And for me, oddly enough, it was rather underwhelming. I have to say, I've just written a feature about Apollo 11 for our regular independent column, which is online. And I remember seeing it. I was a kid. And I watched on television. My parents were not in the slightest bit interested. Small black and white television screen. And I watched Neil Armstrong coming down to the moon. And yes, it was a very, very hairy landing. And his first quote was, "Magnificent sight out here." And then when Buzz Aldrin stepped out, he said, "Magnificent desolation," which I thought was a fabulous quote. But I just felt the whole thing was very political.
What I remember about it, Heather's got one up on me, but she actually saw it. I mean, I know that the old grainy footage, they couldn't really work out what was going on there. But my parents, bless them, had booked us a family holiday on a canal boat. Way back in the 1960s, that wasn't nowadays everyone's cruising around with the canals, but that was an unusual thing to do at the time. It's a fantastic holiday, but unfortunately the timing was such that we were moored in Gas Street, Basin and Birmingham at the time. And
I know it well. Particularly in those days, a particularly grim location.
But I remember lying, so I didn't have television, but I had that transistor radio, and I held it to my ear in this canal. I was thinking 200 years ago, this was the cutting edge of transportation, the British Canal Network. And here was I in this canal boat listening to people go, landing on the moon, how things change.
Well, they do. And I was talking with David Whitehouse at the beginning of this program, old friend of this show, and you will know him well. And we were both reflecting on the fact that this was probably, in human history, the first event that united people in that way. It was covered by the electronic media, and everybody was listening to it as you were in Birmingham and watching it as you were, Heather, at the same time. It united the world in a way that nothing else ever had.
Well, it did, but it was political. So if you're on the side with the Americans, and this all was great and gung-ho, but of course the space race was a political contest, a Cold War contest between the Russians and the Americans, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that although we now build it as being, it says on the plaque, we went on for all mankind. It wasn't. It was a political fight.
Just to interrupt, in 1961, President Kennedy said, in front of the US Congress, he said, the United States should commit itself to achieving a goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. But frankly, it was a very hollow political speech. Kennedy, from my knowledge, was not interested in space travel. And you have to remember when he made that speech in front of Congress, it was the height of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And the US had to prove that they had the hardware to shoot missiles to any part of the world and beyond. And eventually they won. So I have to say I was very underwhelmed by the whole thing.
Well, that's interesting. And again, we've reflected in this show some of that because we discussed something that I hadn't heard of before now, that a lot of the technology for the actual rocket came from Polaris, which of course was a military rocket system.
That's exactly what happened when Kennedy made that speech, and it seemed as to everyone was listening at the time like this was incredibly audacious to commit themselves to it. But as you said, the guidance system, the computer, was incredibly important, was developed for Polaris, and in fact, the Pentagon already had that under their belt. The Air Force was actually building the huge rockets for the first stage, the F-1 rockets. In fact, it wasn't clear quite what the Air Force was going to do with such huge rocket engines, but those were there, and Kennedy was told they were there when he made that speech to go to the moon. So, yeah, it wasn't just pulled out of a hat. He did know that they had the hardware there. But, of course, they were trying to leapfrog the Russians. I mean, you will have
covered this already in the program, but the Russians had launched their first satellite, which took America by surprise. It launched the first person, Yuri Gagarin, the first woman, the first pair of people into space. Yes, I know. Well, the Americans sent up monkeys and chimps. Yeah.
They're called astronauts.
And all of them, as you rightly say, played their part.
Absolutely.
In what culminated in the Apollo 11 moon landing, which was an astonishing thing. Just thinking back to that time, because we've established on this show tonight another fact that I didn't know. I've learned so much about it. That 4/5 of the population alive now won't have been around, will have no knowledge of what it was like to be there and to appreciate this and to go through it. So, both of you, if you could just give me a sense of what it felt like to be part of this.
Well, for me, I was interested in astronomy and what was out there. I looked at the stars, I had my telescope, the space program, really filled me with excitement. And yes, it was a contest, but I suppose when you're a boy of that age, contests are exciting. It's like your favourite football team winning, who was going to get there first, what was going to happen along the way. So I was very, very involved in it. And I remember I had to despair with the Apollo 1 fire when the 3 astronauts were killed on the ground. So yeah, I was really gunning for it. And when I got there, but when they got there, for me, that was sort of another. I really felt we had got to another world for the first time, and that things were never going to be the same again.
While I sympathise with what Nigel's saying, I have to say that I did see the whole thing as being overtly political. The thing that did really make my imagination go into overdrive was actually the Apollo 8 mission, which took place in 1968, when 3 astronauts literally orbited the moon about 8 times and went round the back of the moon and saw the far side of the moon for the first time.
And indeed, whether that was by chance or by deep planning, because a lot of that unfolded over Christmas, didn't it? Over the Christmas holiday.
Yeah. Well, in fact, it was not actually deep planning. It's because they knew that the Russians the Russians had 2 space agencies. One was going to put the man on the moon, the other was going to send cosmonauts around the moon and then back to Earth, and they're 2 different rockets. So the rocket to land on the moon, the big N1 rocket, which is like the Saturn V in America, wasn't ready yet, but the Proton rocket, which was powerful enough to send people around the moon and back to Earth, had been tested and had taken some reptiles around the moon and back again, and they landed safely back on the Earth. So NASA knew that the Russians had the technology to send living creatures around the moon like Apollo 8 and back. So they were really worried the Russians were going to get a cosmonaut around the moon first, and that's why they leapfrogged their program, and they got Apollo 8 to go around the moon, which it wasn't originally intended to, just so they could steal the march on the Russians.
And of course, this wasn't a bit of jolly technical rivalry between those 2 great nations. This was the height of the Cold War, and something else I learned on this show tonight was that the Americans genuinely feared that the Russians might do something to sabotage Apollo 11.
Well, they did, and they actually had a probe that went to coincide with Apollo 11, and it crashed, and that was basically it. But just to go back to Apollo 8, I feel that, I must admit, I was not impressed by the selection of the Apollo astronauts. They were very boring test pilots, and they had no real communications anything like that.
Didn't they have to be that kind of person?
That's what NASA was selecting at the time. We had no choice. But just to go back, I will say one of the astronauts, Anders, on the Apollo 8 mission, he looked at the backside of the moon, and it is an amazing terrain. It's very different from the side of the moon that we get to see. That the moon has been braked by the Earth's gravity, so one side of it faces us completely, and people often refer to the far side of the moon as the dark side of the moon. It's not. It always gets sunlight, and so they were orbiting it in sunlight. And Anders, one of the astronauts on board, said, "Gee, it looks just like the sandpit in my kid's garden. It's pock-marked with holes and everything like that." And he just gave a most fantastic description, and I was really excited by that.
Did we learn? This is a bizarre question. We know about the technological spin-offs from the space program, but Apollo 11, the moon landing, apart from discovering that there were a lot of craters which we knew about anyway, apart from the fact that we knew there was a lot of grey dust that you could drive over or walk over, what exactly did we learn? What came out of it?
Let me jump in here, Howard, because I think this is very important. they actually managed to collect a third of a ton of moon rocks from the moon. And they sent them out to hundreds of scientific institutions.
And some of them have gone missing, haven't they?
Sorry?
Some of them have gone missing.
Yes, there was a set which turned up in a private collector actually sold them at auction. NASA actually tried to stop that legally, but because the roof was so circuitous, they couldn't actually stop it happening. And that was a contingency sample which Neil Armstrong picked up when he first set foot on the moon. He took a small bag of rocks back in, his had to blast off immediately, and that's now in the hands of a private collector. But when it comes to the science side of it, as they were saying, they sent it around the world, one of the main labs, and we should put in a British plug here, went to the Open University, and it's the guys at the Open University in Milton Keynes who have actually done a lot of the analysis of the lunar rocks and worked out, along with others around the world, where the moon came from. And that was the big result of the Apollo missions, to find out the origin of the moon.
This is the whole point. I mean, what they found is the moon rocks were very, very similar to Earth rocks, and what it implied is obviously the moon was very associated with the Earth. In fact, it actually came from the Earth, and it seems that 4 billion years ago, a body about the size of Mars, amazing, collided with the Earth, nearly destroyed it, and the Earth became a kind of gooey lava mass, as you like it. But some of the splodges came out, formed a fiery ring around the Earth, and very quickly, apparently in about 2 days, it actually created the moon, which is an amazingly large body. It's a quarter the size of the Earth, actually a bit bigger than that. And it's actually part of the Earth. It's actually being created as basically splodge from the Earth.
You're reminding me that we learned that the moon wasn't made of green cheese.
I don't know if they ever tasted it, actually. That's puzzle.
We learned that it wasn't made of green cheese, and it wasn't totally, completely alien. We learned that, in fact, it fitted into our own story, as exactly you said. Just one thing that I want to bring out of this thing. For the first time, perhaps, we saw a scientific event that was also simultaneously being presented as entertainment, both sides of the Atlantic. We had James Burke over here and Cliff Mitchell Moore, and we had Walter Cronkite in the United States, and they were doing presentations. Do you think that those two things in that era fitted together particularly well? The idea that this was being shown as prime-time entertainment, alongside the fact that there was very serious and very risky science going on here.
I think the thing is, having worked as a television producer myself, and obviously well aware of the media, that television is an entertainment medium. And Heather and myself were a production company, Pioneer Productions, and made hundreds of hours of documentaries. But you can't just do a documentary on television like it's a textbook. You have to entertain people. It's infotainment, is the name of the game. And I think they were people who had to realise for the first time back then, if you have something which has got a lot of serious content to it, if it's television, you actually have to hype up the entertainment side of it. Find people like James Burke and Patrick Moore, as you say, to come along, and people will watch it and they will empathise with what's going on because of the characters who are doing it. So, I think that probably was quite a formative moment in the story of them popularising science.
Now, we're going to have to try and keep this question short, so I'm going to keep questions short. I really can keep the answer between you. But it's an interesting one to end with, really, I think. We're going back to the moon. What is it that we need to be learning this time? What are we going to be looking for?
Well, I honestly, Hal, don't believe it's worth going back to the moon. First of all, people have landed on the moon, so the symbolic thing has been done. With robot craft, we can get rocks. If you want to get rocks from different parts of the moon or put seismometers on the moon, find out what's inside it, we can do that with robots. Living on the moon is hard, there's no atmosphere, it's the tiny amount of water in the rocks, it's very difficult to get it out. I see absolutely no reason for going back to the moon. I think we should press on to Mars.
I agree entirely with Nigel. I think we need to get onto Mars. It's going to be a very, very dangerous journey. It's going to be 6 to 9 months in an environment that is wholly hostile, with cosmic rays, with radiation from the sun, well, it's just going to be very dangerous.
So when you get to Mars, it's a much better place to live. You've got water there, frozen into soil, but you can melt it and get water out which you can drink. You can turn it into rocket fuel. You turn it into hydrogen. There's slight protection from the atmosphere. It's a much better place to be heading for.
And you can also grow plants on Mars and things like that. The grow plants basically in containers.
As indeed they did in the movie The Martian.
Indeed.
Do you think, last question, very last question, do you think that when we go to Mars, is it going to feel the same? Bearing in mind that we're going to be broadcasting that to a generation who've seen everything virtually on their phones and on their devices. You know, there are a few things now that provide wonderment and interest to that extent. So do you think, your gut feeling, that it will feel the same?
I don't think it will ever feel quite the same, but I think there will be the same level of excitement. I really do think it is going to be seen as an epoch-making event.
I agree with Nigel. I mean, the whole thing about the fact, is the life on Mars, if I can basically quote a certain pop song, I think there is life on Mars. I think it's very, very primitive life, and I think we need to actually look into that and look for our own origins in the solar system.
And I can't, for one, wait to find that out, because I feel the same as you do about that.
Okay.
Very quickly, both of you always are, working on another book?
Oh yes, we've got another one coming out in about a month and a half.
Excellent, what's it called?
It's called Stargazing 2020, and it'll be out by the end of August. Stargazing 2019 has sold out twice on Amazon. We can't believe it.
And you still have The Universe Explained, which is 185 questions and answers.
Which I still have on my bookshelf at home. Listen, we've got to go. Thank you very much to both of you. You know that we will talk again, and we will be thinking across the month that is to come of July about those people who literally boldly went to a place that no one had ever been before. Heather Cooper, Nigel Handbest, thank you.
Thank you.
The Unexplained Apollo 11 50th anniversary special. Still to come, we've got an astronaut, Jack Reesner, coming on here, and Joe Pappalardo, famous American space journalist. And I want to speak with Joe now about Apollo's legacy. Where we go from here. Joe, thank you very much for coming back on.
Always a pleasure.
So, Joe, before we do the legacy bit, just talk to me about your recollections and your thoughts. I don't know whether you were around at the time of Apollo, I suspect not, but your thoughts about that era.
Yeah, I'm definitely not of that era, but I certainly studied. It's impossible not to recognize the achievements of Apollo and how it shaped everything that followed. And a lot of times, I want to say that out front, that there's a lot of space technology and technology in general, silicon chips and computers, the basic physics, the guidance control systems, a lot of what Apollo achieved. I won't denigrate it, but the other part of Apollo was that it was hugely wasteful, and it's not a great model of where to go forward. So, if I critique Apollo, it's not because I don't think it's cool, and I don't think it was an enormous achievement. Obviously it was, but the way they did it was not sustainable. The way that it was constructed, in some ways, it was a disappointment. They achieved a lot, but there was no steady presence and no follow-on, and that's why I'm more excited about what's going on now. I think it'll be bigger than what happened during Apollo.
Now, isn't that interesting? You say that it was wasteful. Now, is it, in your view, wasteful because they didn't know any better? Or was it just that somebody somewhere had decided they're going to throw an awful lot of money at this thing?
It could have been streamlined, certainly. I mean, on one hand, it was very, very fast. The speed was of the essence. So if there was a question of doing it faster and doing it more expensive, they would do that. I mean, whenever speed is of the essence and political urgency, beating the Russians is of the essence. Well, it leads you to take chances. It also leads you to spend a lot more money, and the amount of GDP dedicated to that space program was enormous, and the urgency came from the politics, from the geopolitics, really, and that was the primary driver, and that opened up the checkbook. But once the achievement happened, the checkbook sort of closed again, which is the problem with politically motivated expeditions of this sort. That the follow-on tends to get lost, as well as the really deep science. So, and the follow-on science. I mean, you learn more from a campaign than you do from a single trip or a single excursion, and that was the promise of Apollo, to really open up space. It did, but then it sort of closed shut again and now we're seeing it reopen in ways that are pretty exciting.
We haven't talked about it before on this program today. We should. Why was the follow-on neglected? Why did we wait?
There were missions planned. There were, things were underway, and the budget got trimmed. It was not as urgent. The idea was, well, we went to the moon and we proved that we could do it, and there was no good idea on how to utilize resources. It was too expensive. That with ongoing wars and conflicts, there was other priorities and other ways to combat the Russians. It was still Cold War thinking, and the idea was, well, the space race is not that big of a priority. But Vietnam certainly is, and modernizing the military certainly is, and the economics at home certainly are, and it gets caught up in those political ebb and flows, and that was it. That the priority shifted, and because it was such a big model, it was such a big government model, when the government funding dried up, that was it. The space program had to limp along, and the space shuttle was supposed to be the cheaper alternative to really open up orbit and open up low Earth orbit, and that's a whole other discussion, but that's sort of where all the attention went to in this reusable system, and that didn't really prove out as well as it should have either. So, the baton was handed off to another sort of program in the International Space Station as well, and now the baton's being passed off again, but to something we hope has a little more permanency because of the commercial space interest and the idea that they'll be opening up launch as well as space operations, as well as space habitats, as well as possibly even interplanetary exploration to private interests and asteroids as well. And that hopefully will give the sort of permanence that all these other government programs didn't.
But the shocker from what you've said, and again, this is something that I haven't really reflected on over the years, but of course it's true. The fact that we didn't go back, the only word for it is sad. And the great achievements of Apollo 11 and those missions that followed, the Apollos that followed up to 16, 17, I think it was at the end, all of that was sacrificed. The possible progress in the future was sacrificed on the altar of politics. It was something that was born out of politics in the first place. And it ended because of politics.
That was it. That was the original sin. And the real sad part was when you have people like Buzz Aldrin saying, well, we've been to the moon, there's no reason to go back. And, I mean, they're still studying the moon rocks and finding out things from the moon rocks that were collected in the 70s. I mean, that was the science marches on. And the idea that there's nothing to learn by going back to the moon, even from a scientific perspective, is sad. And, when you talk, and I've interviewed astronauts who call it a lost generation, where there was, all these great advances were pretty much neglected, and the promise was sort of broken. And it is sad that a lot of the astronauts feel that sadness. And right now the only tonic for that is that we lost a lot of time, but right now, if you're optimistic, you'll see at least the chance that it will open up into something that is more active, more permanent, where there's businesses, where I would say everyday people with a lot of money certainly can get involved, but scientists who want to launch payloads and do science will have that chance. The cost is coming down precipitously, so there's a better chance than any other time in human history to see space really open up and to be utilized, and for people to get there in more of a permanent way as well. So all of that is in our generations within sight now, which is pretty exciting.
So for me, one of the takeaway points from this conversation is that you are one of the people who thinks that actually it's not a question of forget about the moon now, let's get on to Mars. You think that the moon can still give us something?
Absolutely. I absolutely do. I think that the scientific possibilities there are amazing. It's so close that a lot of the things that people want to do on Mars, you should probably try it out on the moon first. And if there's infrastructure there, like the NASA Lunar Gateway and the human space flight goes the direction we want it to, it could be a great destination as well. Space telescope would be great on the dark side. The geology, the history of the solar system sort of being rewritten right now, and there's a lot of data you can collect there. So I think it's a great active place, and resources as well. Don't forget that there could be a lot of research, including water ice. that could be very, very useful. And it'll save a lot of money. You won't have to ship it from the Earth up into space. So I think it's a great place to utilize. And I think that this more recent NASA thinking is let's open that up to commercial interest and see what happens. So the gateway is commercially driven. Those facilities in and around the moon will be open, maybe even on the moon, will be open to commercial interest as well. So the downside of that is possible branding. The Starbucks, orbital space station, or the Starbucks lunar base, or some cool thing. But the positive side is, the science and the funding, and again, the fact that you can change administrations in the United States and the funding will totally shift from one thing to the other. There'll be a sense of continuity because there'll be business interests who are involved in it. And that's, for better or for worse, at least it provides the continuity.
Looking back at the people who went there, in particular Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, if we needed to do something like that now, not that we would need to put on a program like that again, but if we had to do something like that, and this is just a total flight of fancy really, I suppose, do you think that there are people around today, around NASA, around the space program generally, who have the kind of white stuff that they have?
I don't see that as a problem at all. I think one thing that'll be different is they won't necessarily need to be fighter pilots. They won't need to have combat experience. It's good to have that discipline and structure and know how to accept that kind of risk. And there's a lot of good things about being a pilot that come with that. But as training. But you'll see that the crop these days are not necessarily pilots, but engineers, scientists, people who can run the experiments. So the right stuff may be a little bit different or judged differently, but the basic grit and willingness to accept risk and put yourself out there, there's no shortage of that in the United States. And there's no shortage of really smart, dedicated young people who would do that. And a lot of people, some of them are training now, some of them are in the astronaut corps, some of them are outside the astronaut corps, but they all have that interest and that willingness to do the dangerous and uncomfortable work that spaceflight actually will be, especially on the front end of it. So, yeah, I think that the problem will be too many people applying. And what do you want to do when you get there? If you don't have a clear mission, you don't know who to pick. So, it all depends on what you want to get there. The Japanese billionaire wants to send artists around the moon to get some sort of a global art project with perspective from space. That's his idea. So if that's the objective, the right stuff would be an artist who would have the fortitude to do something that's dangerous and strange. I would go if you want the writer. I'll put myself out there. So, but if you want to do, asteroid mining, or you want to do mining assessment, that's going to be different. So the disciplines are going to be different, but I think that willingness to explore and take risk it's inherently American, not to get too jingoistic about it, and it's not in any kind of short supply. I think people would be lining up around the block to do it.
Now, the progress in space tourism has not exactly been fast and direct, has it? There have been delays in this thing. We're only going to look at the Virgin Galactic plans and other plans to send ordinary, fair-paying people up into space. Do you think we will ever get to the stage where we are able to shoot people around the moon?
Yeah, I don't think it'll be something that happens very often, but once these projects are being funded now. Blue Origin has a very active program, the Blue Moon program, to get people slingshotted around the moon and possibly stop at a station. SpaceX has those plans. Again, there's even one being funded. So the interesting thing is that NASA is sort of applying the lessons that it learned in this commercial launch, getting astronauts and cargo to the space station, and they're applying that to the moon. So lunar architecture trips, resupply trips, all that will be coming through the commercial pipeline, which means if you have enough money, you can pay to do it as well. And once NASA proves it out, that's usually the proof of concept will come through NASA, as it did with commercial crews. So you have some sort of surety that the systems are safe. It's been demonstrated before for a government client. So yeah, I think within our lifetimes we'll probably see it. It won't be often, and it'll be the billionaire set. But yeah, we'll see it. And the suborbital stuff will start later this year. To me, it's a real sideshow. It'll be nice to see it just because it's been promised for so long, but that's a very different markets, very different dynamic, different hardware. It's a lot easier to send someone up to basically the edge of space for a couple minutes and bring them back down. Comparatively easy. I mean, it's all difficult, but the space tourism, if the entire space industry is looking for the tourism part to sustain it, then there's real problems. There's other better ways to make money. There's other things that you can do that have bigger impact on the Earth and on Earthlings than that biomedical research and throwing protein crystals in space and figuring out how to manufacture things in space. You don't have to launch it. These are the things that will sustain the industry a lot more than launching Leonardo DiCaprio for a couple of minutes of weightless.
Very last question. Very last question. If you were in one sentence to tell a 5-year-old who asked you, what did we get from going to the moon? 5-year-old who will have no concept of what it was like to be alive at that time, what would you say?
Well, I'd probably try to bring it home with a hard example and say that the technology that's in your smartphone that you're watching in the back of your car, when instead of kicking your little brother, on the seat next door, if you're looking at your smartphone, they wouldn't have developed that without the Apollo program. And then I would say that that would be my sense. Look at your smartphone and imagine if you didn't have one. And there's a lot of, it's not just Tang that was invented as a spin-off from everything that was learned. It was a very deep, it had very deep roots.
Good point to part of this conversation.
From it.
Joe Pappalardo from Popular Mechanics, thank you very much for your time. We'll talk again. Thank you.
Take care. Have a nice one.
You too. Joe Pappalardo there from Popular Mechanics, space writer. And the last thing we're going to do is talk, because we have to an astronaut. Somebody who was, well, this is an interesting story. He was going to be part of the Apollo program, but ended up being very much a part of Skylab. If you've never heard of Skylab, it was a sort of forerunner to the International Space Station, and some people say it was much more interesting in many ways. Jack Loosman is the man we're speaking with in the U.S. Jack, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And by the way, I was there for the entire Apollo program. I got there when the Gemini program was just finishing up, so I was on the support crews for 3 of those flights, 9, 10, and 11, 9, 10, and 13. I'm the guy who took the call on the Apollo 13 mission when they said, Houston, we got a problem. And so that's how the new guys got acquainted with the system, and that's how we learned. We helped the flying crews get ready to go, and we trained ourselves for an Apollo program during those lunar landings. Very much involved on the ground, and hopefully we were going to fly in the future, but they canceled those last 3 flights, so those turned into Skylab missions.
So you were very nearly an Apollo man, but you ended up doing something else. So if you were there from the back end of the Gemini program, which was the immediate predecessor, where a lot of lessons were learned about space, what was that like to go through that whole program, to go through that experience with people who, of course, became household names?
Well, there were about 30 astronauts there when I arrived, and in fact, the original 7 astronauts are still there. This was way back in 1966. And so those of us were in the 5th group of astronauts. There were 19 of us selected in 1966, and that was about the time that Gemini 9 was flying. So we were there for the last 4 Gemini flights and getting ready for Apollo. So we all trained for Apollo missions, and while we were brand new there, the guys who were there already were obviously going to fly first, and then we were going to start flying after they. We joined some of their flights. Some of the guys in my group were able to fly on the Apollo program. And then there were a few of us left over that didn't get to fly the last 3 missions because they were canceled. So we were assigned to the Skylab missions, and I stayed around long enough to command the 3rd test flight of the Space Shuttle Columbia in 1982.
I didn't know this about you. This is exciting. Did you actually believe when you went into it, when you went into the Apollo program, were you given the impression that there was a chance that you could have been one of the people to set foot on the moon first?
Oh, absolutely. We were in cadre of people that were training for all of those flights. And most everybody who was in our group flew by the time the Skylab missions had gone. So we were all training side by side with the people who were already there, helping them with their flights to begin with, learning in that manner, contributing to their flights, and that's how we got acquainted. We were all training in simulators, flying helicopters, and doing all the things that Apollo astronauts were going to do.
Now, the Apollo astronauts, from what we know of them, they were all characters. Buzz Aldrin, very different from Neil Armstrong. You were all different people. You all had your own strengths. When you were part of that, and I think you said there were 30 people in your group, how did you all get on? Did you feel that you were a team?
Well, there were 30 people when I got there who were already there, and we added 19, so it made about 50. We called ourselves specifically the Original 19, and so we really had a group of 50 people, so to speak, when I first got there. And everybody was pretty much an independent person and not afraid to say what they thought, and always knew they were right, and the other guys needed to listen.
Right, and the training itself. I think we've all seen things like the Vomit Comet, where you learned to be in zero gravity, and we've seen things like the underwater training. For you, what are your recollections and your thoughts about that time when you were going through that training, which, let's face it, for most of us would have been difficult, maybe impossible?
Well, yeah, I flew lots of flights in the Vomit Comet, and of course the Vomit Comet was a 707 large commercial-sized airplane that had no seats in it, and padding on the walls, and the pilots would take it up, and we would train in the back, and in the passenger section, and the pilot would fly it such that they would climb very rapidly and then push over and hold zero gravity for about 30 seconds. And by that time, of course, the airplane was diving to the ground. We all had to hit the deck and make a pull-out, and it was about a 2G pull-out, and then go through that again.
So you got 30 seconds of what it was like to be weightless in space. When you actually got into space,
kind of like going in the air through, like a porpoise, up and down, and after a while, some folks didn't feel very well, so it got a nickname, the Vomit Comet.
I can well understand that. But when you actually got into space, was the experience like the experience you had on the plane?
It was quite a lot like the experience, but you didn't know how much different it might be until you actually went into space yourself. And so we were then able to come back and evaluate the kind of training we got in the zero-gravity airplane with what reality was. And so those who had a chance to fly in space, we knew what the deficiencies were. So we could temper what we were learning in the zero-gravity airplane with the knowledge that we already had. And we not only trained some of our procedures, but we also developed some of our equipment so we'd know how it would work in zero gravity as opposed to one gravity. And the similar could be said for the water tank. We would go underwater because underwater you can be suspended in this medium, and although there's a viscosity of the water in a way, you nevertheless can train for some of those zero gravity things and develop your equipment underwater, but it also has its deficiencies. And once you've been into space, well, you know what the deficiencies are in the underwater training as well as zero gravity training in the Vomit Comet. So it was a way to develop our instrumentation, develop our equipment, as well as to understand the effects of being in a weightless condition.
And what did it feel like personally to be going through this thing? Was it possible to live anything that we might regard as a normal life, to do ordinary things, to go out with people, have fun, do other stuff? Or were you totally focused all the time on the task in hand?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that. We were regular fellows. We enjoyed our work. It was first of a kind. It was pioneering, and we all enjoyed that. But we enjoyed being with the settlers as well. We had a good family life. We had good relationships with each other, and we were a team when we were working together, and we had our private lives, just like regular folks down the street.
The 11 crew, you will have known them. What are your thoughts about them? Were they people that you liked? Were they people that you got on with?
Got on them very well. I did like them, and I was there for the whole time that the Apollo program was in operation. Of course, we lived about a block away from, down the street from Neil Armstrong, and his neighbor was Ed White. And we lived in a subdivision in which there were a number of astronauts, and there were a few of those kinds of subdivisions around the Space Center, which was about 25 miles outside of Houston. So we would get together, as neighbors as well. And I remember the night that the Apollo 11, that Neil Armstrong was getting ready to walk on the moon. his house was just bombarded with news media and search sites and photographic lights, trucks with platforms on them, and just a huge number of people out in Jane Armstrong's front yard. And my son was about 6 years old, and he went outside and he said, "Hey, Dad, I think I can see him on the moon."
What was he like? All the accounts that I've read and the interviews that I've listened to with him suggest that Neil Armstrong, the man who did this amazing thing that most of us can't even imagine what that felt like. But most of the accounts we have of him is that he was a very quiet man, and certainly after Apollo, of course, he became a bit of a recluse. What are your thoughts about? What are your recollections of him?
Well, I recall Neil's being a very personable guy. He'd be out in the yard raking leaves with his kids in the fall and his two boys, and he'd be helping with the Boy Scout operations when they had a banquet or something like that. And he lived a pretty much normal life, taking his kids fishing in the lake nearby and so forth. And when he was in the office, of course, he was kind of a quiet guy. But he had a strong reputation. You know, he was an X-15 pilot before he got with NASA, and before that he was a Navy fighter pilot. So it wasn't as though he was a civilian totally either. And he was a very personal fellow. I'd walk by the office and chat with him a little bit once in a while. And we'd have a pilots meeting every Monday morning. And he'd be there, and he didn't speak very often, but when he spoke, everybody listened because he had something unique to say. He was very articulate, and he delved into areas that some of us hadn't delved into before. So he was very forthcoming when the opportunity presented himself, but he didn't impose himself on anybody either.
Now that fits with all the accounts that I've heard. When they picked him to be the first person to set foot on the moon, along with Aldrin, how did you feel? Did you feel let down? Did you feel disappointed? Or were you happy for them?
I was happy for them. I knew that I was going to be at the end of a long line, and the people that were there first were going to fly first, and then they started getting into my group of people. So the best thing I could do was support them, to learn from them. I would read all of the post-flight reports. I'd listen to their debriefings and so forth, and that's the way we learned. And we also learned by being part of the support teams. I was, like I mentioned, there were 3 support crew members from my group who supported all of the Apollo missions. And these were guys who were not going to fly, but this is the way we learned and also contributed to the mission. And we would usually be the capsule communicators, and one of my special jobs for the first 2 lunar modules on Apollo 9 and Apollo 10 was to take the ship through the test and checkout at the Kennedy Space Center. The lunar module would come from the manufacturer in Grumman, and we would have to go through a test and checkout procedure. Might take up to a year for the first Apollo 9 lunar module because it's brand new. And my job was to represent the flight crew in making decisions about the way it was getting through the test process. Decisions were made by the engineering team that affected me as a pilot and an operational person, and I would speak up and say, this is the way the flight crew needs to have this decision made. And we were usually rewarded with a positive answer. If not, we would go to a higher level and get it all straightened out. But so my job was to make sure that
you played in it, Jack.
Ready to fly.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but the part that you played in it was a vital part, but it wasn't a part that was getting the headlines. The headlines were going to the names who were going to the moon first. How did that feel, to be part of a vital part of the support team, but not actually one of the headlines? How did that feel for you?
Well, it felt all right because I was learning what I needed to know to finally be where they were, and I had a lot to learn. They had already learned it, and this was an opportunity for me to learn. When I was first selected to go to the Skylab, I'd already had 700 hours of being in the lunar module cockpits and the lunar module simulator, so I knew that lunar module like the back of my hand, and I knew that would come in handy, but I would not have had that experience had I not been placed where I was. So I think I was placed to fly when my turn came, and I was willing to grant the fact that the people who had to before me had more experience and were the ones that I would fly first. And then we to be assigned to those experienced ones on a 1-by-1 or 2 basis as time went on.
And like you say,
I felt very comfortable.
Like you say, everything that you learned as being part of Apollo, even though your missions were cancelled, it was all important for what you came later to do, and that was Skylab, that was the forerunner of the International Space Station. But you're a human being, we all are. The day that they told you that the missions that you were part of, the last missions, were not going to go ahead, they were going to be cancelled, that must have been a bit upsetting, was it?
Well, it was disappointing, but on the other end, there was nothing I could do about that except to get ready for what was ever going to be next until I learned that there was going to be a flight with the Russians. And I thought, well, maybe this will be my last chance to get on board. Skylab doesn't work. I think maybe what I'll do is I will take a course in Russian language. And so I did that on my own. I did it through the University of Maryland. And I went through the whole Russian language course. I took the exams, and then I got my diploma, and I turned it into my boss and said, look, if was ever going to be a Russian mission, I'm ready to go. But by that time, the Skylab was already was affirmed. And the limbo for quite some time, but by that time, the Skylab was ready to go. But I was ready to go on that as well because I knew all I needed to know about the command module. We trained for that mission after we were signed for 2.5 years. And we worked with everybody under the sun, all the experimenters, all the system managers and so forth to know how to operate the Skylab. But the training I'd got during Apollo, that fit right in and added on to when I got into Skylab. And we were all trained to do each other's job in case there was some kind of a situation where one of our fellows...
You had to work as a team.
We did, and we all knew what the other guy had to do, and we could do his job.
Now listen, this is going to sound like a weird question to you because you've been there, done that. But to me, I am never going to experience this. So you'll understand why I'm asking you this question. What is it like to be in space?
That's a great question. That's the first question most people ask. It's the longest one to answer, but of course, when you're there, you're weightless. So your weightlessness is a very pleasant, comfortable, relaxing feeling. After we were there a short time, we didn't even think about walking. We just push off and end up where we wanted to go. And imagine being able to glide to the top of your ceiling and change a light bulb with no ladder, or do flips and tumbles off the wall, or even go to sleep right out in mid-air. It's just a wonderful, relaxing, pleasant feeling.
And when you come back to Earth, Jack Loosma, it must be the most enormous letdown.
Well, we were ready to come home. We tried to stay longer so we'd be the longest ones, but they said, no, you've got to come home. And so there's a kind of interesting joke that goes around that was unique to us. When we went to the Skylab, all of the equipment for 3 crews was in the Skylab space station and was fired off into space above 270 miles above the Earth with nobody in it, but all of the equipment for 3 crews that were going to go up and visit it. And things were rationed to us. We couldn't get into the other crew's food or clothes and so forth. So every 2 weeks we would have a change of coveralls, but every other day we would have a change of skivvies. That's underwear in military terms. At the end of the mission, we were supposed to stay for 56 days, and they're going to say that at the end of that 56 days that we'd run out of skivvies, of course, but that'd be all right. But it turned out that we were not going to be over the landing ships in the water for 4 more days. And so they said, you got a problem in that you're not going to have enough skivvies. So they said, don't worry about it. On day 58, we'll come up with an answer. And so on day 58, they came up with the answer, and those are in the days of good news and bad news jokes. And they said, the good news, you're going to get to change your skivvies today. The bad news is now you change your Jack, you change your own, and so forth.
Now that is Apollo humor. My last question for you, Jack.
We love being on scale. We had 60 experiments. It's like launching a scientific laboratory into space, and we had to live and learn to live and work.
And people need to remember what Skylab achieved after Apollo. My last question for you is one that you've probably been around quite a few times, I think. When you had to tell people what you do for a living, what you did for a living, and you say to them, well, I was or I am an astronaut, what's that like? What kind of reactions did you get?
Well, I usually don't tell them, and if they find out about that, why then I just tell them. I'm a very fortunate person. I got to do something that I wanted to do. I didn't know when I got into it what I was going to be like, but I knew that I wanted to be part of it because it's going to be great for our country. It's going to be great for humanity. It was pioneering all the way. It was unknown. It was a challenge. And I didn't do it for the money because we just got military pay. And, did it for fame or power or glory. I just did it because I saw it as a challenge. It was a way to do something that had never been done before. It was going to be tough to do, and that I knew I could do it. So it was that kind of a way that I approached it. And when people ask me about it, I just tell them I answer the same way that I do with you. They ask questions, I'd like to be there, and so forth. Some of the other things that people like to know about is the fact that you're going around the world at 17,500 miles an hour, wow. 270 miles above the earth. You're going around the world every hour and a half. And during that time, you're in the daylight for 60 minutes and the darkness for 30 minutes. So you have 16 sunrises and sunsets every day. And the sky is always black in space. Even in the daytime, the sky is black. But at night, you look out the window and you see about 5 times as many stars as you can see on a tall mountain from the ground clear night because there's no atmosphere in there to obliterate those stars.
Most of us can't even begin to imagine what that was like. Now, I'm being wrapped up here by my producer, but I want to ask you one very final thing. When a kid comes up to you, and presumably this has happened, and says, why did we go to the moon? What do you say?
I say we went to the moon because we could, because we knew that it was going to be good for everybody from what we learned. We weren't smart enough to know what we didn't know. And you can just see that by what happened after that. We didn't have computers like we do today. There's no internet. There was a whole lot of things that we didn't have then we have now that are a result of our having done that. Look at all the advancements we had in medical science because of the technology that we developed while we were in space. And militarily speaking, it brought the Soviet Union down because we are now able to intercept their ballistic missiles and they couldn't intercept ours just using the technology that we learned on the moon. Everything, or by going to the moon, everything we had to do had to be faster and better and more reliable, and so that made its way into our public lives.
All of those things. Well, listen, I know because we had a certain amount of effort to go through to get you on here, and I'm really grateful that you've been able to do this, that astronauts at the moment, because of this anniversary, are in massively short supply. Jack Loosma, thank you very much for telling me your story.
Well, come to see us with Ken Willoughby on October 2 to 5, and we'll be in...
Right. This is an event that you're in, isn't it? And what is the event that you're going to be appearing in here?
It's with Ken Willoughby. It's Pontefract, they call, I think, but it's going to be in Manchester, and it'll be organized by his organization, Space Lectures.
Right. So they're actually called the Space Lectures. You are coming over to be part of that, and we look forward to seeing you. Maybe come on this show. Nice to see you. I might come up to Manchester and see you myself. Jack Loosma, thank you for your time.
Glad to do it. Thank you for the great pleasure. Nice talking to you. I look forward to seeing you there anyway.
Thank you. God bless.
God bless you too. Happy landings.
And my thanks to Jack Loosma for being part of this, to get to speak to a real-life astronaut. I've done it a couple of times, but it never fails to absolutely amaze. So if you've just joined us now, you have missed an amazing walk through the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 mission and the landing of man upon the moon. Now, yes, it's a long time ago, but I think as you've heard over these hours, we've learned a lot from that. And that was a very special time in the existence of mankind. Even if 4/5 of the planet alive today don't know anything about it and weren't there, it was truly remarkable in every possible way. Thank you to everybody who's been part of this show. Thank you very much for Ollie for helping me to get the guests on the show. Thank you to David for doing the production of the show. Thank you to Holly for doing technical production tonight. And above all, thank you to you for being part of this. And we're going to go back to a regular edition of The Unexplained. The first one is due now next week. So until next we meet here on The Unexplained with Talk Radio, my name is Howard Hughes. This has been The Unexplained on Talk Radio, and please, whatever you do, stay safe, stay calm, and above all, please stay
The Unexplained with Howard Hughes on Talk Radio.
Across the UK on DAB digital radio and online worldwide at talkradio.co.uk. This is The Unexplained, the most ear-opening show that appears on the air just about anywhere. From Todmorden to Toledo, from